Hey guys, tonight we're going back in time to a place where marble gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, togas were considered hot formal wear, and public toilets had no doors. That's right, welcome to ancient Rome, but we're not just sightseeing tonight. No, we're going straight for the juicy bits. Sex, scandal, and the messy tangle of private desire and public duty. Be warned though, this isn't some romantic stroll through a candlelit villa. This is a city where power was everything and sex was never just about pleasure. It was politics, it was performance, it was sometimes punishment, and it was often deeply uncomfortable. Basically, you probably won't survive this with your modern sensibilities intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing how far this strange little community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin the night at the Forum Romanum, and no, not for a political rally. You're here because you've heard whispers about a new law that just passed, another piece of social engineering from Augustus himself. The Lex Julia, they're calling it. Sounds innocent enough until you realise it's not about taxes or land. It's about morality. Specifically about who you're allowed to sleep with, when, why, and what's going to happen if you step out of line. Augustus, Rome's first emperor and possibly the world's first PR-obsessed politician, is terrified. Not of armies or assassins, but of moral decay. He thinks Rome is getting too soft, too hedonistic, so naturally he decides to fix the empire's sex life. The Lex Julia cracks down on adultery, pushes people to marry, and tries to shove upper-class women into making more babies. Yes, seriously, the state is now officially in your bedroom. Here's how it works. If you're a man and you catch your wife cheating, you are expected, no, required, to divorce her. If you don't, you could be charged as a pimp. And if you're the guy caught sleeping with someone else's wife, you could be exiled, or worse, forced to spend the rest of your life in Sardinia, which back then was basically the Roman version of being sent to your cousin's basement with dial-up internet. Of course, this moral panic doesn't apply equally to everyone. If you're an elite Roman male, you can sleep with slaves, prostitutes, and concubines without legal consequence. It's only adultery if you mess with another man's wife, or daughter, if she's officially off the market. Otherwise, it's just you being you. In fact, Roman law doesn't actually define sex in terms of mutual pleasure or consent. It's all about who's doing what to whom. As long as you're the penetrator and you're not dishonouring another citizen's household, you're good to go. Welcome to Roman logic. So here you are, standing on the stone steps of the Basilica Julia, listening to a sweaty magistrate yell out amendments to the law, while senators in spotless white togas pretend to look concerned. Everyone's pretending, really. Because let's be honest, half these guys have secret lovers stashed away in Trastevere and a standing tab at the nearest lupanar. The moral law is mostly for show. It's performative, meant to make the empire look squeaky clean from a distance, while everyone privately keeps doing what they've always done. There's something kind of tragically hilarious about it. Augustus wants to make Rome great again by telling everyone to behave, but no matter how many laws he passes, he can't change the fact that Roman society is built on a deep, unapologetic hierarchy of bodies. Some bodies are sacred, others disposable. Sex isn't just a private act, it's a social manoeuvre, a legal issue, and often a weapon. And there are loopholes, of course. Oh, so many. A man can legally abandon his wife if she doesn't produce enough children. But if he just doesn't like her anymore, he can find a reason. Maybe she laughs too loud. Maybe she's not as modest as his new concubine. The law gives him an out, and no one really questions it. Meanwhile, if a woman even flirts too boldly with the wrong man, she risks being labelled a meretrix, a term that blurs the line between sex worker and promiscuous woman. Labels in Rome stick like tar. Even the gods are in on the action. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, is honoured with festivals that conveniently turn into excuse-heavy parties for flirting and hookups. At the same time, Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses, are threatened with live burial if they so much as look the wrong way at a man. It's a divine double standard, coded into both myth and marble. Now, here's your quirky fringe fact of the evening. Roman census takers didn't just count people, they tracked who was married and how many kids they had. If you were single for too long, you might get hit with a tax. That's right, Augustus literally taxed bachelorhood. Think of it as Tinder, with penalties. But not everyone was buying into the Augustus purity campaign. Some historians believe the law had the opposite effect. It made private behaviour even more decadent, just better hidden. Kind of like those college campuses where abstinence-only education leads to record STD rates. It turns out people don't like being told not to bone. That's still up for debate, by the way. Scholars argue over whether the Lex Julia was actually enforced or just a glorified scare tactic. There are records of high-profile trials. Augustus even exiled his own daughter for being too promiscuous. But it's unclear how far this went for the average citizen. Did Rome's working-class folks really care what Augustus thought of their love lives? Or did they roll their eyes and go right back to the tavern for another drink and another round of flirting? You step away from the noise of the forum, slipping into a narrow alley that smells like old wine and roasted chickpeas. Somewhere above you, laundry flutters on a line, and someone's laughing behind a curtain. The law is out here, technically, but so is real life. And real life in Rome? It's always messier than marble. The thing is, in Rome nearly everything loops back to power, especially sex. And no one holds more of it than the Roman paterfamilias. That's the head of the household, by the way. Not just the guy who pays the bills and yells about turnips being too expensive. He's got legal power over every living creature in the domus, from his wife to his grown sons to the droopy-eyed slave who washes his sandals. And when it comes to sex, the paterfamilias gets first say, last word, and every heavy-handed middle in between. So let's say you're a Roman man of some standing. Nice villa in the Suburra, maybe a little country estate with olives and vines, the works. You've got a wife, a couple of kids, a few household slaves and a reputation to protect. Society expects you to be in control, not just of your own urges, but of everyone else's too. Your household's honour, your name, even your political standing depend on what your wife does in bed. And who knows about it? Not because she's her own person, obviously, but because she represents you. Which is wildly unfair, but very Roman. You see your young son eyeing the serving girl? You look the other way. Boys will be boys, right? But if your daughter so much as trades secret smiles with a musician, you're suddenly arranging a marriage at record speed. Virginity matters when it's female and patrician. Male desire, that's practically a rite of passage. You as paterfamilias are supposed to mould it, contain it, exploit it if necessary. You can even arrange training. Yes, training. Some historians suggest it wasn't uncommon for a father to provide a prostitute for his son's first time, just to ensure things were done properly. Like a twisted version of driving school, but with more groaning. Here's where the Roman model gets especially thorny. There's no such thing as equality in sex. Everything's arranged in a hierarchy. Active versus passive, penetrator versus penetrated. And the dominant role always belongs to the citizen male. If you're being penetrated and you're a free Roman man, that's shameful. You've lost status. But if you're the one doing the penetrating, whether it's with a female slave, a male slave, or someone paid by the hour, then you're just expressing dominance. Pleasure is allowed, but only if you're winning. That makes for some weird math. A Roman man can sleep with other men, but only if the other men are socially beneath him. Slaves, foreigner, as prostitute, same goes for women. The law and public opinion are less concerned with your orientation and more with whether you're acting your social rank in bed. Think of it like a game of bedroom chess. As long as you don't let yourself become the pawn, you're golden. Take Marcus, a fictional but plausible mid-level Roman bureaucrat. He's not a senator, but he's got connection, a healthy inheritance, and a complex about aging. His wife Fulvia is known for her beauty, her elaborate hairdos, and her discreet silences. Marcus is in charge of the household, but he's also a man of the city. He goes to the baths, he drinks in taverns, and yes, he keeps a side arrangement with a Greek boy named Diodorus. The neighbours know. Everyone knows. But no one says a word because Diodorus is a freedman and Marcus pays him handsomely. This arrangement doesn't raise eyebrows. Marcus is still the alpha. If Fulvia had a lover, though, Marcus would be expected to drag her to court and make a public spectacle of it. Double standards don't even begin to cover it. Sometimes the power imbalance is unspoken, woven right into the architecture. Walk into a Roman house and look at the way the rooms are arranged. The triclinium, the dining room, is public, a place for posturing. The cubiculum, the bedroom, is not just private, it's performative. It might be positioned just off the atrium, a visible reminder that the paterfamilias sleeps at the centre of his world. You don't go in there unless you're invited or summoned. And here's a delightful little fringe fact for your nightmares. In some Roman households, newly acquired slaves might be sexually broken in by their owner or even guests as part of dinner party entertainment. Yes, that's as awful as it sounds. Some historians debate how widespread this really was. Was it shock value storytelling or daily reality? But even the rumours speak volumes about how disposable some bodies were considered. It wasn't just tolerated, it was ritualised. You're starting to feel a little grossed out, maybe? That's normal. Modern morality doesn't sit comfortably in Roman sandals, but for them, this all felt orderly. Sex wasn't about love or even mutual satisfaction. It was about hierarchy. And that hierarchy reflected the Roman worldview perfectly. Citizens above slaves, men above women, active above passive. Even in pleasure, structure reigned. Let's rewind to one of the strangest laws tied to this system, the jus vitae necisque, the right of life and death. As pater familias, you literally had the legal authority to kill a family member or slave for dishonouring the household. It wasn't done often, but the power was there. So if your wife's lover got caught sneaking out of your villa, you could legally execute him right there. Think of it as DIY justice, Roman style, swift, bloody, and almost always male-directed. This extreme authority extended to preventing scandal before it even happened. A paterfamilias could marry off his daughter at 12 if it secured a political alliance. He could force her into a convent of Vestals, or keep her under lock and key in the name of honour. She had no legal autonomy, no say in her own body. Everything passed through her father, then her husband. Her womb was basically a political tool. Romantic, right? And yet strangely some Roman women managed to carve out power in this landscape. Elite matrons might influence decisions behind the scenes, control inheritances, or build social clout through their sons, but sexually, they were expected to be ghosts, silent, modest, and invisible. A walking paradox. They had to be fertile but never seen desiring, beautiful but not provocative, present but never powerful. As the moon rises over Rome, you pass through a villa courtyard where a mosaic catches your eye. It shows Dionysus reclining, half-drunk, surrounded by the nymphs. There's something wild in their eyes. Freedom, maybe. Or madness. It's the Roman paradox again. Power and surrender, structure and chaos. Desire always ruled by someone. You walk on, the city whispering with secrets in every shadowed column. Out here the laws are firm, but the hearts, they're messier. Still, the paterfamilias sleeps soundly. His world is intact. For now. Let's talk about Roman women now, and let's be honest, it's not going to be a feel-good episode. Because if you were born female in ancient Rome, the rules were different from your very first breath. And when it came to sex, the system was all about control, with a generous side of hypocrisy. You're expected to be pure, loyal, fertile, silent, and basically invisible unless paraded like a trophy. But of course you're also blamed, watched, desired, and accused if you're even slightly too visible. Welcome to the lifelong tightrope walk that was Roman womanhood. You're not imagining it. The double standard is real and it's baked deep into Roman society. Remember that whole business about the Lex Julia? Well, it wasn't just a piece of moral legislation, it was a weapon. It allowed husbands, and even fathers in some cases, to accuse women of adultery in public court. If found guilty, a woman could be banished, stripped of her dowry, and forced to live outside the city walls. But what about the men? Well, unless they were caught sleeping with someone else's wife, the law basically gave them a free pass. And even if they were guilty, exile for a man usually meant a scenic villa in the countryside with a view of the sea and a dedicated wine cellar. Now here's where it gets really twisted. Roman women were expected to be virtuous and sexually modest, but they were also expected to look stunning. That meant elaborate hairdos sculpted with beeswax and hot irons, layers of makeup made from crushed minerals and questionable animal byproducts, and gowns that hinted at curves without showing too much. It was a trap. Look too good, and you're tempting. Look too plain, and you're failing your social duty. It's like being stuck forever in a high-stakes job interview, but for your husband's reputation. And don't get it twisted. This wasn't just a matter of reputation. It was literally your survival. A woman who was publicly shamed for being promiscuous could lose her legal protections, her citizenship status, even her access to her children. The word infamis, shameful, was stamped across her social identity like a scarlet letter, and there was no real comeback from that. Now, a quick side street into an odd but fascinating corner of Roman culture. Women weren't just judged for being too sexual, they were also accused of witchcraft if they tried to control sex in any way. That included using love potions, birth control, or brace yourself, refusing sex in marriage. In fact, some Roman sources describe women who avoided sex as dangerously subversive. One philosopher even suggested that too much chastity in a wife could unbalance her humours. So yeah, damned if you do, hexed if you don't. Still, some women found loopholes. Wealthy widows, for example, could become surprisingly powerful. Once their husbands died, they were no longer under male legal guardianship. Some of them controlled vast estates, lent money, even hosted their own salons. A few had reputations as courtesans in all but name, educated, witty, flirtatious, and very much in charge of their own beds. Of course, the gossip followed them like smoke, but in a way that just made them more legendary. Let's pause on a real historical woman for a second, Clodia Metelli. Born into a powerful patrician family, Clodia was notorious in her time for being bold, sensual, and unapologetically intelligent. She hosted poets, threw dinner parties that stretched until dawn, and may or may not have slept with her own brother, or at least that's what Cicero accused her of when she became politically inconvenient. Truth or slander? We don't know, but it says a lot about how dangerous a sexually independent woman was considered in ancient Rome. She didn't have to actually do anything scandalous, she just had to act like she could. But the average Roman woman, she didn't have Clodia's resources. She was under the thumb of her father, then her husband. Her main job was to produce legitimate sons, manage the household, and stay out of the kind of trouble that made her public property. Even something as innocent as walking unchaperoned through the marketplace could raise eyebrows. A woman's reputation was like glass. One crack and it was ruined forever. You might be wondering, did love ever factor into Roman relationships? Honestly, sometimes. There are letters and inscriptions that hint at genuine affection between couples, playful nicknames, romantic dedications scratched into stone. But love wasn't the goal. Marriage was a transaction, a contract, a strategic alliance between families. It was about dowries and heirs, not moonlit walks and poetry. If passion existed, it was a happy accident. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Roman women had a special type of underwear called a strophium, basically an ancient sports bra made of linen strips. But what's more interesting is that elite women sometimes wore sheer dresses that deliberately showed them off. Some sources complain about this trend like cranky uncles. Women today are practically naked, which tells us that even in a hyper-patriarchal society, some women pushed boundaries where they could, usually with fabric and a whole lot of side-eye. And here's where scholars butt heads. There's ongoing debate about just how restricted Roman women actually were. Some argue that elite women had far more agency than we give them credit for, operating behind closed doors or through sons and lovers. Others insist that even the most privileged Roman woman was just one bad rumour away from social ruin. The truth probably lives in the uncomfortable middle. Some women found ways to bend the rules, but the system was still designed to keep them in place. As you wander past a statue of a veiled woman, her marble features serene and blank, you can't help but think about how much these women had to suppress. Desire wasn't denied to them entirely, but it had to be kept secret, tucked beneath layers of propriety like a hidden clasp under a toga. They could want, but they couldn't show it. They could feel, but not act. And when they did act, they were shamed, punished, or erased. The streets are quieter now, lit by oil lamps flickering in alcoves. You imagine the women behind those thick wooden doors, mothers, daughters, wives, servants, each navigating their own narrow corridor of expectation. And in the silence you hear the echo of a question that never really goes away. Who decides what a woman can be? In Rome the answer was simple. The men did. The law did. The empire did. But the whispers tell a different story. Clodia's laughter, Fulvia's quiet rebellion, the flirtatious glance of a merchant's daughter at the forum. Somewhere beneath the marble, the women of Rome are still alive, still dreaming, still daring, still finding ways to breathe in a world that tried to keep them small. Now that you've got a handle on how tightly Roman women were expected to behave, let's shift the lens slightly onto the Matrona, the Roman ideal of womanhood, wrapped in layered wool and layers of expectation. She's not just a wife, she's not just a mother. She's a walking, breathing billboard for her husband's reputation and the moral backbone of the empire, supposedly. Her role is central, sacred even, but it's also claustrophobic in ways that might make your ribs hurt just hearing about it. So picture this. You're a wealthy Roman woman from a good family, married off before you were old enough to know what sex really was. You live in a beautiful domus, yes, and you wear dyed silk stolas and have handmaids to help with your hair. But you also wake up every day knowing your body is not really yours. You're here to represent your husband's virtue, your father's honour, your family's alliances, and Rome's fertility statistics. Basically, you're the empire's moral wallpaper. A Matrona is expected to be chaste, loyal, dignified, and silent. But she also has to manage a household economy, supervise slaves, raise children, keep track of social obligations, and somehow never be seen having too much fun. If she laughs too loudly at a party, someone's whispering. If she's too witty at a banquet, someone's offended. If she leaves the house too often, she's wandering. The perfect Matrona doesn't just behave, she is behaviour. Even clothing was a built-in reminder of her place. Married women wore the stola, a long pleated dress layered over a tunic, and sometimes a veil called a palla. These weren't just fashion choices, they were social signals. The veil marked her as someone respectable, someone untouched by scandal. She might hate it, especially in the summer heat, but removing it outside the home could get her labelled a prostitute. And once that label stuck, good luck shaking it. Now here's where things get tricky. Despite all this pressure to be modest and invisible, the Matrona was also expected to bear children. And not just any children, legitimate male heirs. No pressure, right? Childbirth was terrifying, often deadly, and completely expected of her. If she failed to produce a son, her value as a wife could plummet. It didn't matter if it wasn't medically her fault. Rome didn't really care about biology. The assumption was always the woman is the problem, and if she did manage to give birth to a few bouncing baby boys, she wasn't exactly rewarded. She still had to stay faithful, manage the household, and never slip up in public. Her sons might go on to hold office, speak in the Senate, or lead armies, but she would always be a few respectful steps behind, quietly proud, publicly invisible. She was the foundation of their greatness, but rarely its headline. But, and this is a significant but, some matrons managed to wield quiet influence. Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus himself, was perhaps the most famous example. She played the long game, staying serene and stately in public, but behind the scenes? She was an expert in dynastic chess. Whispers suggest she helped secure the succession of her son Tiberius by eliminating political rivals, maybe even through poison. No one could ever prove it, of course. She smiled too softly for that, and Livia wasn't the only one. There were others, Agrippina the Younger, Cornelia Africana, women who mastered the tightrope of Roman virtue while pulling strings like seasoned politicians. They used their status as matrons to protect, promote, and sometimes manipulate. In a world where female power was taboo, the Matrona could still be a power broker, as long as she played her part convincingly. But those were exceptions. The average Matrona lived within a strict perimeter. She could appear at religious festivals, especially ones reserved for women like the Matronalia, where she offered flowers to Juno and prayed for her husband and children. She could host family dinners, walk in the company of other women and gossip, quietly, cautiously. But her freedom was always conditional. If her husband decided she was acting improperly, he had legal recourse to banish her, divorce her, or worse. Now here's your quirky tidbit. If a Matrona was caught in adultery, Roman law stated that she had to be locked up for 24 hours with her father or husband, and that they were given a tight window to decide whether to execute her or banish her. No, really. The idea was that her betrayal had endangered the moral fabric of the household, so someone had to take charge of her punishment, fast. It's justice by kitchen timer. This all raises a serious scholarly debate that still hasn't been settled. Did Roman women genuinely internalise these ideals, or did they simply perform them for survival? Some argue that the cult of the Matrona was so powerful that many Roman women found pride and identity in it. Others say they were trapped in a golden cage, navigating a system that offered very little room for true autonomy. The truth, as always, is murkier than we'd like. And let's not forget that not all Roman women were elite matrons. Some were poor, working alongside their husbands or as merchants, cooks, or midwives. For them, the ideals of the Matrona were aspirational at best, irrelevant at worst. But even they were influenced by the expectations swirling around womanhood in Rome, especially when it came to how they were supposed to behave sexually. The sun sets behind the Palatine Hill, and you watch as a veiled woman climbs the temple steps to leave a small offering. She moves like someone practiced at being unseen. You wonder what she thinks when she closes her eyes. Is she praying for her children, for protection, Or maybe, quietly, for something no Roman law could give her: freedom, privacy, the right to want. You follow her down the marble steps in your mind, tracing her footsteps through a world built to monitor her every move, and you realise the Matrona may be the symbol of Roman virtue, but she is also its prisoner. Her life is all about appearances, boundaries, and careful obedience. But even within those rules, some women learned how to tilt the world slightly in their favour. Maybe it was in how she raised her son. Maybe it was in the alliances she built with other women. Maybe, just maybe, it was in the secrets she kept from the men who thought they knew everything. Let's step away from the primly veiled matron now and duck through a different door, one draped with coloured fabric, buzzing with low laughter, sandal-scuffed floors, and the soft tinkling of a lyre in the background. You're entering the world of the courtesan. And no, this isn't some Roman version of a back alley brothel. These women are different. They are educated, sometimes witty, often dangerous, and always one step ahead of the game. Courtesans, meretrices, honestiers, or respectable sex workers are the glittering fringe of Roman society. Not quite respectable, but not quite ignorable either. A Roman courtesan might not have a name carved into history like an empress, but she could make senators stumble over their togas. She wasn't just beautiful, she had to be clever, entertaining, cultured. She read poetry, played music, kept up with politics, and knew exactly how to flatter a man's ego while draining his coin purse. In a society where most women were told to be silent, courtesans were hired specifically to speak, and to charm, seduce, or destroy, depending on the evening's mood. Let's say you're one of these women. Maybe your name is Cytheris, like the real-life freedwoman who became a sensation in Cicero's day. You were born a slave, trained as an entertainer, and eventually freed by your patron. Now you recite poetry in the gardens of the elite. You dine reclined beside men who rule provinces, and you wear perfume imported from Egypt that costs more than a soldier's annual pay. You aren't a wife, so you aren't bound by a husband's rules, but you're also never truly safe. Your value is tied to your beauty, your novelty, your ability to make powerful men feel something: desire, amusement, awe. And while you're given more social space than a Matrona, that space is slippery. You can be a muse one week and a cautionary tale the next. Roman poets were obsessed with women like you, elevating you in verses one day, then skewering you with venom the next. Take Propertius and his lover Cynthia. She was likely a courtesan, and in his poems she's both goddess and monster. He worships her one moment, then accuses her of cheating, scheming, aging. There's no middle ground. A courtesan was either an enchantress or a threat, depending on how bruised the poet's ego was that morning. You live by your wits and your looks, and your relationships with men are transactional, yes, but they can also be complex. Some courtesans became long-term companions, not wives, but almost. They moved in elite circles, received gifts, even secured inheritances, but legally, they were always second class. You couldn't marry a senator, you couldn't claim legitimacy for your children, you were tolerated, even celebrated, but never quite accepted. Still, there was something magnetic about the freedom courtesans carved out for themselves. Unlike the matron, you didn't have to pretend not to desire. You could flirt, laugh too loudly, challenge a man's opinion over dinner without being labelled hysterical. You could have lovers, not just one assigned husband, and while the risks were constant, disease, aging, falling out of favour, you weren't chained to a life you didn't choose. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Some courtesans were actually hired to perform at funerals. Yes, really. Not for sex, obviously, but to sing, cry, and look beautifully devastated. The Romans believed a well-performed funeral helped ease the dead into the afterlife, and who better to do it than a professional performer who knew how to make a room weep? The existence of courtesans also highlights a strange tension in Roman society. On the surface, they were disdained, called greedy, loose, corrupting influences, but beneath that they were deeply desired. Men wrote about them obsessively. They fantasized about freeing them, marrying them, rescuing them from their tragic fate. It was like a cultural fever dream, this obsession with the unattainable, untamable woman. And it was almost always painted with tragedy. Some historians argue that courtesans were the only women in Rome who got to fully inhabit their sexuality. Others say that's romanticizing what was ultimately survival work. Sure, there were exceptions like Cytheris, who seemed to thrive in the role, but for every successful courtesan, there were dozens who were discarded when they aged out or lost their appeal. Rome was harsh and memory short. If you weren't consistently desirable, you were replaceable. So imagine you're one of these women, reclining on a cushioned bench beside a man who's pretending not to be married. You sip watered wine, your bracelets jangling softly as you tilt your head just enough to keep him enchanted. He laughs too loudly. He's already planning his next poem. But you're thinking beyond tonight. You're thinking about how many coins he'll leave behind, how much perfume you can buy, whether you should switch patrons next month, whether you've already overstayed your moment. And somewhere across the city, Matrona is lighting a lamp and saying a quiet prayer for her husband's safety. She doesn't know where he is. She suspects, but she won't ask. Asking implies that she cares, and caring, publicly anyway, is dangerous. The line between courtesan and wife is vast and razor-thin. One has social respect but no voice, the other has voice but no respect. And both are caught in the same system, just wearing different masks. As you step back out into the Roman street, the laughter from the courtesan's house fades into the clatter of wheels and footsteps on stone. You realise that Rome isn't just a place of laws and power, it's a stage, and every woman, whether noble or notorious, is being watched. Some find a way to write their own script. Most just try not to get written out. Now it's time to leave the velvet cushions and perfumed courtyards behind. No liars tonight. You're heading somewhere grittier, louder, and frankly, a lot smellier. Welcome to the underbelly of ancient Rome's sex industry, the world of prostitutes and street life. And if you think you've seen rough neighbourhoods before, you haven't walked the alleyways behind the Subura after sunset. The word the Romans used most often for prostitutes was meretrix, which literally means one who earns. And that tells you a lot about how they viewed it. Less about sin, more about status. If you earned money for sex, you were a meretrix, and that meant legal registration, taxation, and public shame. There were different classes of sex workers, and they weren't all the same. Some worked from brothels, lupernaria, others from taverns, and some literally plied their trade in doorways or alleys with little more than a thin tunic and the hope of a few denarii before sunrise. Let's paint the scene. You're walking through a Roman street near the Circus Maximus. It's noisy, chaotic, the kind of place where olives roll under your sandals and the air smells like sweat, wine, and something vaguely fishy. Graffiti is scrawled on the walls, some of it lewd, some just practical. Arrows point toward brothels. Stick figures demonstrate the services. One doorway has a crude carving of a phallus, and it's not subtle. The ancient Romans loved their graffiti, and when it came to sex, they didn't bother with metaphors. Step into a lupanar, and it's nothing like the high-end world of courtesans. The rooms are tiny, little stone beds built into the walls with hay or thin cushions. No privacy, no softness. Some are painted with erotic frescoes, menu boards basically, depicting different positions, maybe to spice things up or help illiterate clients choose quickly. There's usually a fee scratched into the wall. 2 asses, 3 if you're feeling fancy. It's not romantic, it's business. And the women who work here, most of them are slaves. Some were born into slavery, others sold into it. A few are free women desperate for money, war widows, abandoned wives, the destitute. Rome had no welfare, no safety net. If you had no man to claim you, no dowry and no connections, this could easily become your only option. You might think a Roman prostitute would have some kind of legal protection, but nope, quite the opposite. They were legally marked as infamims, meaning they had no social standing and no ability to testify in court. They were outside the law, stripped of honour. If a client abused them, they had little recourse. If a guard harassed them, same story. Their existence was transactional, their personhood a matter of convenience. And yet the state taxed them like any other worker. Rome didn't protect sex workers, but it definitely profited off them. Here's your strange but true Roman fringe fact. Some brothels had built-in toilet seats right next to the beds. Efficient, sure, dignified, not even close. The Romans were very practical about bodily functions, and nowhere was that more evident than in their brothel designs. It was all about maximising traffic, like the world's earliest fast food joint, but with more moaning and less grease. The sex wasn't always consensual. In fact, it often wasn't. This was a system rooted in domination and survival, not intimacy. Some of the graffiti in Pompeii's Lupernaria reads like Yelp reviews from the underworld: nice breasts, quick service, or too loud, not worth the coin. It's brutal, crass, and heartbreakingly impersonal. Women were rated like meat. If they cried, no one cared. If they outgauged, they were replaced. But here's a twist. Some prostitutes, even in this rough world, found ways to build a name. They became known in their neighbourhoods, developed loyal customers, even gained a weird sort of street fame. There's an inscription about one named Maritima, Queen of the Alley, which is both tragic and oddly impressive. She might have been the best in the district. She might have just had good branding. Either way, she mattered, in her own corner of the city. Now, a lot of modern folks want to ask the big question, was any of this empowering? Did any of these women feel autonomy in their work? And that's where historians split. Some argue that, like modern sex workers, Roman prostitutes carved out identity and income within a broken system. Others say that's reading too much freedom into a world built almost entirely on coercion. The truth is probably somewhere in between. If you were lucky, you got regular clients who didn't hit. If you weren't, you got passed around like a coin purse. And speaking of coins, some prostitutes wore tokens called spintriae. These were small bronze or brass tokens stamped with erotic images and a number, possibly used as brothel currency or admission tickets. Their exact purpose is still debated. Maybe they were a kind of prepay, maybe they were just souvenirs for the truly weird. Either way, they're another example of how transactional Roman sex was, even at its lowest rungs. You pass a tavern now, its door flung open, spilling music and torchlight into the night. Inside, women laugh too loudly, serving wine with one hand and stroking thighs with the other. These tavern girls blur the line between waitress and sex worker, and many of them sleep upstairs for a fee. They're technically free, but their lives are no easier. They drink to stay warm, fight off drunk customers, and learn to read the mood in a room like gladiators read an arena. A wrong move could mean violence. A clever one might score a few extra coins or a night off. It's important to remember that sex work wasn't illegal in Rome. It was licensed, taxed, and everywhere. The shame didn't come from the act. It came from the status. A man could visit a prostitute with no loss of dignity, as long as she was the right kind of woman, low status, enslaved beneath him. But if he dared fall in love with one, that was scandalous. That challenged the hierarchy. That made people nervous. And so you keep walking through Rome's darker corners, past flickering torchlight and whispered offers. The city is always humming with desire, but here, that desire is raw, unpolished, unforgiving. You glance back at a girl leaning in a doorway, arms crossed, eyes hollow. She might have once been someone's daughter, someone's sister. She might still be. But here, tonight, she's a commodity, like wine, like olives, like marble. Bought, used, forgotten. And that too is Rome. Let's head into a realm the Romans understood better than they probably should have for their time, but in a way that might make you raise a very modern eyebrow. Tonight, you're going to learn how ancient Rome handled male-male encounters. And spoiler alert, it was not about orientation the way we think of it now. If you were hoping for rainbow flags and pride parades in the shadow of the Colosseum, well, not quite. Rome wasn't interested in who you loved, Rome cared about who was on top. So here's the deal. Roman society didn't think in terms of gay or straight. Instead, it used a very Roman metric: dominance and submission. That's the golden rule. If you were a freeborn Roman man, your job, your civicae, masculine duty, was to penetrate, not be penetrated. You could have sex with other men, sure, as long as they were socially lower than you. Slaves, prostitutes, foreigners, entertainers. But if you let yourself be the receptive partner, that was the fastest way to be mocked, lose status, or get disqualified from holding office. The bedroom had a political floor plan. So let's imagine you're Lucius, a young Roman man from a solid equestrian family. You're 20, confident, slightly overdressed. You're surrounded by men who are constantly asserting power. At the baths, at the forum, at dinner, everyone's watching everyone. If you admire another man's body, that's fine. If you even joke about sharing a bed, fine. But if anyone suspects you're too fond of being on the receiving end, you might get a nickname like Sinaidas, a derogatory label implying you're soft, effeminate, too into perfume and dancing. And let's be honest, no one wants their political campaign wrecked by accusations of being a pretty boy in the worst sense. Now, there were exceptions. Some emperors were shameless about their preferences. Nero, for instance, famously married not one but two men, first Pythagoras, whom he played the bride to, and later a young freedman named Sporus, whom he dressed as an empress and paraded around like his consort. Was it love? Was it a joke? Was it a giant flaming middle finger to the Senate? honestly, no one knows, but it horrified traditionalists. Not because Nero slept with men, that was expected, but because he upended the roles, he blurred the script, and Rome hated that. And don't get the idea that same-sex affection was rare. In fact, it was common in art, especially in earlier periods when Rome borrowed heavily from Greek culture. The Greeks had their own complex rules around pederasty, relationships between older men and adolescent boys that were idealized in certain educational and mentorship settings. Rome sort of inherited that model, but with far more suspicion and judgment. The idea of a mentorship with an erotic undertone survived, but by the time of the Empire it was more taboo and more closely policed. Here's your quirky corner fact. Romans were obsessed with beards. Why? Because beards helped define who was the dominant partner in male-male sex. A beardless boy was considered appropriate to desire, temporarily. Once he grew a beard, hands off. He was now supposed to take the dominant role. The beard was like a biological do not enter sign, and ignoring it was considered perverse. So yes, your facial hair could literally dictate your social sexual position. Back to Lucius. He has a friend named Dama, a handsome slave his father purchased last year. Dama sleeps at the foot of Lucius's bed, runs errands, and sometimes, on particularly slow nights, climbs under the covers. Lucius doesn't talk about it. Not to his mother, not to his friends, and definitely not to his future wife. It's just what men do. Dama has no say, of course. He's a slave. He belongs to the household. What Lucius is doing might not be love, or mutual, or fair, but it's socially acceptable. As long as Lucius maintains control, as long as he never feels too much. Now, let's zoom out. Among the elite, things get weirder. Roman poetry is full of men mocking other men for playing the wrong role. Catullus accuses rivals of losing their swords in bed. Martial, the ultimate snarky gossip, writes epigrams skewering senators who pay young men to degrade them. It's all about power and humiliation. You can sleep with anyone, technically, but if you submit, you're no longer a Roman man. You've become something else, something people laugh at. The state didn't officially criminalize same-sex behavior. Again, as long as the roles were maintained. But socially, it was a minefield. If you wanted to enjoy men and maintain status, you had to be calculated, careful, and always dominant. And heaven forbid your opponent in court found out you once cried after a night with a dancer named Gaius. That kind of thing could, and did, ruin political careers. Scholars still debate how widespread same-sex relationships really were versus how often they were simply weaponized as insults. Some argue that Rome was surprisingly tolerant in practice, even if it was harsh in public rhetoric. Others point out that the intense obsession with dominance suggests deep cultural anxiety, like Rome couldn't quite make peace with male desire unless it could control it with a whip and a ledger. There's truth on both sides. The records we have, poems, graffiti, satire, don't lie, but they don't tell the full truth either. And yes, Rome did have same-sex couples who seem to have formed genuine partnerships. We even have tomb inscriptions where men refer to each other with affection, using phrases typically reserved for husbands and wives. One famous tomb in Rome, belonging to a pair of male freedmen, includes a relief showing them dining together, reclining on the same couch. It's subtle, but in Roman terms that's practically shouting, "We were more than friends." As the stars fade into the Roman sky, you pass the entrance to a quiet villa where a flute plays softly and the laughter of men drifts into the night. Inside, a group of wealthy bachelors toast Bacchus and trade barbed verses. One of them, slightly drunk, leans against a friend a bit too closely. They share a look that says nothing and everything. Tomorrow they'll speak of politics and war. Tonight they're just bodies in the flickering torchlight. You slip away into the shadows, wondering how many of these men are keeping secrets they can never say aloud. And how many believe that wanting, truly wanting, is a form of surrender they'll never afford. In Rome, love is dangerous, desire is calculated. And power? Power is always the bottom line. Now we're stepping out of the bedroom and into the temple where sex takes on a different face. One part sacred, one part scandalous, and one part, let's just say, uncomfortably ahead of its time. Tonight you're going to meet the Galli, the gender-fluid priests of the goddess Cybele. You haven't heard of them? Oh, you will. Because in a city obsessed with order, hierarchy, and strict gender roles, the Galli were living proof that ancient Rome had room, even if only begrudgingly, for those who defied all of it. Let's start with the goddess herself. Cybele wasn't Roman originally. She came from Phrygia, a region in what's now Turkey, and she didn't exactly slip quietly into the Roman pantheon. She was wild, chaotic, maternal, and terrifying. She was the Magna Mater Great Mother, goddess of fertility, mountains, wild animals, and ecstatic frenzy. Rome imported her during the Second Punic War in a moment of national crisis, hoping she'd stabilise things. Instead, she brought her own brand of unhinged spiritual fireworks. Her worship came with a troop of followers unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Enter the Galli, priests who dressed in women's clothing, wore heavy makeup, grew their hair long, and, most shockingly to Roman sensibilities, castrated themselves in a public ritual of religious devotion. Yes, you heard that right. They didn't just symbolically dedicate themselves, they literally transformed their bodies in an act of surrender to the goddess. Picture the scene. It's the Day of Blood, part of the springtime festival called Megalesia. A crowd gathers around a makeshift altar in the outskirts of the city. Drums pound, flutes scream. The atmosphere is electric, raw, disturbing. One by one, the initiates take up knives or sharp stones, dancing themselves into a frenzy. Then, in a moment of wild release, they offer their manhood to Cybele, an act of total transformation. Afterward, dressed in bright robes and jewellery, they are reborn as Galli. Neither man nor woman, something else, something divine. To the Romans, this was equal parts fascinating and horrifying. On one hand, the Galli were tolerated because they were considered sacred. They belonged to Cybele, and Cybele had political backing from the state. On the other hand, their mere existence poked a hole in everything Rome believed about gender and control. Here were individuals living outside the binary, rejecting the Roman ideal of manhood, and doing so with divine authority. Now imagine being a Roman citizen walking past the temple of Cybele on the Palatine Hill. You see the Galli, some with veils over their faces, some singing and dancing in public processions. Their movements are fluid, theatrical. They offer blessings, collect coins, perform rituals. Children gawk, old men scowl, and somewhere between shock and awe, the Galli continue their sacred business, uncaring of the whispers. The thing is, the Galli weren't cross-dressers in the modern flippant sense. Their gender expression wasn't performance, it was transformation. After their initiation, they lived as women, used feminine names and pronouns, and distanced themselves from anything associated with Roman masculinity. They didn't fit Roman categories, and that made them dangerous. Here's a quirky, mind-bending fact for your mental nightcap. The Galli were technically banned from becoming Roman citizens. Yup. Even though their cult was officially recognised, Galli themselves were legally excluded from many civic rights. You could worship Cybele, you could donate to her temple, but if you became one of her priests, suddenly you were no longer eligible to vote, serve in the military or inherit property like a Roman man. It's almost like Rome said, sure, be sacred, but stay on the margins. And scholars still can't fully agree on what the Galli were. Some historians describe them as eunuchs who simply adopted female dress for ritual purposes. Others insist they were genuinely trans-identified in a pre-modern context. People who lived as women, not just in temple rites, but in daily life. There's archaeological evidence, graves, inscriptions, personal names, that suggest this was more than just theatre. But Rome didn't give them space to explain themselves. All we have is how the elite described them, with equal parts ridicule and fear. Poets and satirists, of course, couldn't help themselves. Juvenal, never one to pass up a chance to be a mean girl in verse, paints the Galli as hysterical, weak, even grotesque. He mocks their castration, their femininity, their public rituals, but the venom in his words says more about Roman anxiety than about the Galli themselves. Why were they so threatening? Because they represented a kind of freedom Roman men didn't understand, a rejection of the strict punishing roles assigned at birth. And the rituals weren't just about gender. They were about ecstasy, spiritual possession, physical transformation, the loss of self. Romans didn't like losing control. And Cybele's cult asked for exactly that. Her followers fasted, whipped themselves, danced until they collapsed. It wasn't just about pleasure or devotion, it was about obliterating ego that Rome prized more than gold. Some Galli also worked as sex workers, which blurred things even more. They were both sacred and scandalous. They might sell blessings in the street by day and bodies by night. Roman men, especially the powerful ones, were known to seek them out, not just for sex, but for something stranger, a glimpse into a world outside of Rome's rigid expectations. A night with a gallus wasn't just erotic, it was mystical, alien, frightening. As you walk past the temple tonight, you hear the distant echo of a drumbeat. You imagine the flicker of torches, the scent of incense, the wail of a flute spiralling upward like smoke. One of the galleys dancing, arms wide, skirts spinning. You can't look away. Something in your chest tightens. Fascination, maybe, or fear, or the quiet realization that the world isn't as fixed as you thought. The galley lived at the edge of Roman identity. Not man, not woman, not citizen, not slave. But they were very real. They had voices, lives, rituals, pain, and joy. And though Rome tried to keep them confined to the temple steps, they remain one of the clearest signs that even in the most structured society, there are always cracks. Always those who slip through, survive, and shine. Not in spite of who they are, because of it. By now, you're starting to notice a pattern in ancient Rome. Sex isn't just personal, it's structural. It slots people into categories, draws hard lines between status, and decides who gets to act and who must submit. And nowhere is this more vividly and more heartbreakingly apparent than in the world of slavery. Tonight, you're going to step into the blurred boundaries between desire and domination, where sex and power aren't separate. Because in Rome, owning a body often meant owning its pleasures too. Let's get this out of the way. Roman slavery wasn't based on race, but it was just as brutal and dehumanizing. Slaves could be prisoners of war, kidnapped foreigners, children born into slavery, or people who fell into debt. Once enslaved, you weren't a person, you were property. You could be bought, sold, loaned out, or inherited like furniture. And when it came to sex, that meant you didn't get to say no. In fact, your body was considered just another benefit of ownership, like access to your labour, your loyalty, or your silence. So imagine you're a Roman slave. Maybe you work in a villa near Tiber. You clean, cook, run errands, and sleep on the floor beside the hearth. You have no legal name, no family rights, and no protection from abuse. If your master calls you into his chamber at night, you go. You don't have the option to decline. If his friends are drinking too much at a banquet and ask for entertainment, you're expected to perform. That might mean dancing. It might mean undressing. It might mean worse. And everyone understands that this is normal. For wealthy Roman men, owning beautiful slaves, male or female, was a matter of pride. It showed taste, wealth, power. It meant you didn't have to buy sex. You had it on call, like a luxury. There are surviving inventories from Roman estates that list slaves not just by name and age, but by sexual availability. One historian described this as an empire of access. It wasn't just a social ladder. It was a catalogue of bodies. There's a grim little fringe fact for you. Some wealthy Romans branded their slaves, not just to prevent escape, but to mark their sexual function. A letter, a symbol burned into the flesh, sometimes on the arm, sometimes more intimately. Because once your body wasn't yours, there were no limits to how it could be used. And this wasn't confined to private villas. Public slaves, those who worked in the baths, or served in temples, or laboured in state-owned bakeries, were often expected to trade sexual services as part of their job. Even gladiators, who were technically slaves trained for combat, had a strange place in Rome's erotic imagination. Their bodies were muscled, scarred, and publicly displayed. They were lusted after, but still legally objects. Women left graffiti about sleeping with gladiators. Men bragged about owning them. And the gladiators themselves? They died by the thousands, often without ever owning so much as their own name. What about relationships between slaves? They happened, of course. Desire isn't limited by status. Slaves fell in love, had children, built small hidden lives within their confines. But none of it was protected. A master could separate lovers, sell children away, end a relationship with a snap of the fingers. There was no such thing as marital rights for slaves. If they had a ceremony, it was informal, known as contubernum, a kind of unofficial pairing that, sweet maybe, but fragile. Still, some enslaved people did manage to climb out of this nightmare. Freedmen, slaves who had been manumitted, could earn partial rights. Some even became wealthy, opening businesses, sponsoring public games, buying their own homes. But the stain of slavery clung to them. It was written in their names, their status, their family trees. And if they had once been sex slaves, that part didn't go away either. A freed woman who had been known as a prostitute or concubine might become respectable in name, but in whispers, never. Now here's where Roman society gets even more twisted, because while slaves were forced into sex regularly, the Romans didn't define this as rape. That concept, as we understand it, non-consensual sex as a crime against the person, only applied to free Roman women or children of citizens. If you were enslaved, the law didn't recognise your consent as a thing worth protecting. There was no such thing as your body, only your master's rights. And yet, despite all this, some Romans still managed to romanticise slave-master relationships. In poetry, you'll find verses where a master claims to be enslaved by love for a slave girl, or how her beauty conquers him. Sounds sweet, until you remember she can't say no. It's a fantasy built on imbalance. 1,000 years before 50 Shades, Rome was already dabbling in erotic power play, except it wasn't pretend, it was law. That's a point scholars still wrestle with. How much of a man's sexual culture was truly about desire, and how much was just the brutal enactment of control? Did any of these relationships feel mutual, even in fragments? Or were they always one-sided, veiled in the language of ownership and obedience? Some argue that a few slaves managed to manipulate the situation, gain favour, influence, even affection. Others say that's just us trying to humanise a system designed to dehumanise. The answer? Probably both. It depends on the individual story, but the system itself, that was always tilted. Let's not pretend this was all behind closed doors either. Rome didn't hide its hierarchies. It flaunted them. Public auctions of slaves included details about beauty, docility, and bedroom talent. Erotic frescoes sometimes show slave figures in the background, half-dressed, watching, serving, offered. The sexualization of the enslaved was everywhere, embedded in the visuals, the rituals, even the architecture. As you walk the streets of Rome tonight, you pass a slave market. The crowd is thick. A boy stands on a platform, maybe 16, stripped to the waist, his arms raised as buyers inspect him. Beside him, a girl clutches a small cloth bundle, maybe her only possession. You can feel the weight of what's unsaid, what these people will be asked to do, night after night, behind stone walls that the law pretends are private. No one here is surprised. Rome runs on this machinery. It's just another part of the empire's appetite. And that's what stays with you as you move into the quieter streets, the realization that for all Rome's glory, its columns, its poetry, its dreams of eternity, its core was built on bodies that were bought, used, and often forgotten. Some empires are built with stone. Rome built itself with skin. By now, you're starting to notice a pattern in ancient Rome. Sex isn't just personal, it's structural. It slots people into categories, draws hard lines between status, and decides who gets to act and who must submit. And nowhere is this more vividly and more heartbreakingly apparent than in the world of slavery. Tonight, you're going to step into the blurred boundaries between desire and domination, where sex and power aren't separate, because in Rome, owning a body often meant owning its pleasures too. Let's get this out of the way. Roman slavery wasn't based on race, but it was just as brutal and dehumanizing. Slaves could be prisoners of war, kidnapped foreigners, children born into slavery, or people who fell into debt. Once enslaved, you weren't a person, you were property. You could be bought, sold, loaned out, or inherited like furniture. And when it came to sex, that meant you didn't get to say no. In fact, your body was considered just another benefit of ownership, like access to your labour, your loyalty, or your silence. So imagine you're a Roman slave. Maybe you work in a villa near Tiber. You clean, cook, run errands, and sleep on the floor beside the hearth. You have no legal name, no family rights, and no protection from abuse. If your master calls you into his chamber at night, you go. You don't have the option to decline. If his friends are drinking too much at a banquet and ask for entertainment, you're expected to perform. That might mean dancing, it might mean undressing, it might mean worse. And everyone understands that this is normal. For wealthy Roman men, owning beautiful slaves, male or female, was a matter of pride. It showed taste, wealth, power. It meant you didn't have to buy sex. You had it on call like a luxury. There are surviving inventories from Roman estates that list slaves not just by name and age, but by sexual availability. One historian described this as an empire of access. It wasn't just a social ladder, it was a catalogue of bodies. There's a grim little fringe fact for you. Some wealthy Romans branded their slaves, not just to prevent escape, but to mark their sexual function. A letter, a symbol, burned into the flesh, sometimes on the arm, sometimes more intimately, because once your body wasn't yours, there were no limits to how it could be used. And this wasn't confined to private villas. Public slaves, those who worked in the baths, or served in temples or laboured in state-owned bakeries, were often expected to trade sexual services as part of their job. Even gladiators, who were technically slaves trained for combat, had a strange place in Rome's erotic imagination. Their bodies were muscled, scarred, and publicly displayed. They were lusted after, but still legally objects. Women left graffiti about sleeping with gladiators. Men bragged about owning them. And the gladiators themselves? They died by the thousands, often without ever owning so much as their own name. What about relationships between slaves? They happened, of course. Desire isn't limited by status. Slaves fell in love, had children, built small hidden lives within their confines, but none of it was protected. A master could separate lovers, sell children away, end a relationship with a snap of the fingers. There was no such thing as marital rights for slaves. If they had a ceremony, it was informal, known as contubernium, a kind of unofficial pairing. Sweet, maybe, but fragile. Still, some enslaved people did manage to climb out of this nightmare. Freedmen, slaves who had been manumitted, could earn partial rights. Some even became wealthy, opening businesses, sponsoring public games, buying their own homes. But the stain of slavery clung to them. It was written in their names, their status, their family trees, and if they had once been sex slaves, that part didn't go away either. A freedwoman who'd been known as a prostitute or concubine might become respectable in name, but in whispers, never. Now here's where Roman society gets even more twisted, because while slaves were forced into sex regularly, the Romans didn't define this as rape. That concept, as we understand it, non-consensual sex as a crime against the person, only applied to free Roman women or children of citizens. If you were enslaved, the law didn't recognise your consent as a thing worth protecting. There was no such thing as your body, only your master's rights. And yet, despite all this, some Romans still managed to romanticise slave-master relationships. In poetry, you'll find verses where a master claims to be enslaved by love for a slave girl, or how her beauty conquers him. Sounds sweet, until you remember she can't say no. It's a fantasy built on imbalance. 1,000 years before 50 Shades, Rome was already dabbling in erotic power play. Except it wasn't pretend. It was law. That's a point scholars still wrestle with. How much of Roman sexual culture was truly about desire, and how much was just the brutal enactment of control? Did any of these relationships feel mutual, even in fragments, or were they always one-sided, veiled in the language of ownership and obedience? Some argue that a few slaves managed to manipulate the situation, gain favour, influence, even affection. Others say that's just us trying to humanise a system designed to dehumanise. The answer? Probably both. It depends on the individual story, but the system itself, that was always tilted. Let's not pretend this was all behind closed doors either. Rome didn't hide its hierarchies, it flaunted them. Public auctions of slaves included details about beauty, docility, and bedroom talent. Erotic frescoes sometimes show slave figures in the background, half-dressed, watching, serving, offered. The sexualization of the enslaved was everywhere, embedded in the visuals, the rituals, even the architecture. As you walk the streets of Rome tonight, you pass a slave market. The crowd is thick. A boy stands on a platform, maybe 16, stripped to the waist, his arms raised as buyers inspect him. Beside him, a girl clutches a small cloth bundle, maybe her only possession. You can feel the weight of what's unsaid, what these people will be asked to do, night after night, behind stone walls that the law pretends are private. No one here is surprised. Rome runs on this machinery. It's just another part of the empire's appetite, and that's what stays with you as you move into the quieter streets. The realization that for all Rome's glory, its columns, its poetry, its dreams of eternity, its core was built on bodies that were bought, used, and often forgotten. Some empires are built with stone, Rome built itself with skin. By now you've probably caught on. Cybele. Sex in ancient Rome wasn't just about passion or reproduction or even pleasure. It was about control. And sometimes that control took on its ugliest, most explicit form, not behind closed doors, but in full daylight, as spectacle, as warning, as punishment. Tonight, we're heading into the dark zone of Roman justice and revenge, where sex wasn't a private act, but a public tool, used to shame, to wound, to remind everyone who held power and who didn't. Let's start in the courtroom, where justice in Rome was never quite as impartial as the marble statues suggested. When someone was accused of a crime, especially something tied to morality, adultery, betrayal, the punishment could get weirdly sexual and uncomfortably theatrical. For example, convicted adulterers might be paraded through the streets, stripped partially naked, their heads shaved, a spectacle of humiliation more than justice. The goal wasn't just to correct behaviour, it was to destroy a reputation, to mark the offender as socially ruined, and that was just for citizens. If you were a slave, criminal, or enemy of the state, the punishments could cross into horror. Crucifixion? That wasn't just execution, it was a deliberate act of public sexual degradation. Victims were stripped naked, nailed to crosses, and displayed for hours or days, genitals exposed, bodies twisted in agony. The Romans didn't just want you dead, they wanted you reduced. And yes, that was part of the point. Let's talk about another method, subjugum mittere, to send under the yoke. It sounds almost pastoral, like something you'd do with oxen, but no. This was a ritual humiliation often used for defeated enemies. Stripped naked, they'd be forced to crawl under a wooden beam or arch made of spears while Roman soldiers laughed, jeered, sometimes beat them. To go under the yoke was to become submissive, not just politically but sexually. You were symbolically feminized, conquered, and if that sounds like a stretch, you're underestimating how deeply Romans associated penetration with power. Now, let's take a detour into the world of the military, a group not exactly famous for its gentle diplomacy. In Roman camps, discipline was everything. Soldiers who deserted, mutinied, or were caught in cowardice sometimes faced punishment by fustuarium, a ritual beating to death by their fellow soldiers. And while this wasn't technically a sexual act, the language used to describe it often blurred that line. The word fustuarius shares roots with fustis, meaning cudgel or stick. And yes, it was sometimes a euphemism for a penis. The act of beating someone into submission with a phallic-shaped object. Rome knew exactly what it was doing, the message: this man has lost his masculine honour. He's been symbolically penetrated, feminized, erased. Let's say a political enemy really ticks off the wrong person. Accusations start flying, not of corruption or theft, but of unmanly behaviour. That he enjoyed being passive with male lovers, that he let himself be used like a woman. In Rome, this wasn't just gossip, it was character assassination. If successful, it could ruin a public career. There was no worse insult for a Roman man than being called soft. Not physically, morally, sexually submissive. The insults weren't subtle. Words like Sinaedas, Pathicus, and Mollis were thrown around like verbal daggers. If someone really wanted to destroy you, they didn't need to kill you. They just needed to suggest you liked being on the bottom. Even enslaved people weren't exempt from this twisted theatre. If a slave tried to run or showed defiance, he might be punished sexually, not just behind closed doors, but publicly in front of other slaves as a warning. Some were forced to wear humiliating signs or costumes, paraded through the streets, their bodies marked not just by scars but by insinuation. Rome understood that shame could be more powerful than pain. And here's one of those disturbingly specific fringe facts. There's evidence that some convicted criminals, especially those accused of sexual crimes themselves, were sentenced to execution via bestiality. Yes, really. It was called damnatio ad bestias, and while most people think of it as being torn apart by lions or bears in the arena, there are darker accounts. Some ancient sources describe prisoners being raped by animals as part of a public punishment ritual. Scholars debate whether these were literal practices or exaggerated rumours meant to frighten the masses, but either way, the association of sex with punishment was deeply embedded in Roman spectacle. It's easy to forget that the same people who built aqueducts and debated stoicism also packed into arenas to watch humans be devoured or degraded for sport. The Colosseum wasn't just about blood, it was about humiliation. Executions were often theatrical, costumes were involved, scripts. Sometimes they even staged mythological reenactments, where the punishment matched the story. A man who impersonated Hercules might be tied to a stake and ravaged by an actor, dressed as a wild animal before being set on fire. That's how far Rome blurred the lines between sex, punishment, and entertainment. Even the language reflected this. Words like stuprum and contumelia weren't just about physical acts, they were about insult, violation of status, offence to dignity. To be raped wasn't only to be violated, it was to be lowered, transformed from subject to object, and the Roman world was very clear about who was allowed to be which. Now, scholars argue endlessly about whether Romans actually thought of rape as a crime against the victim, or just the victim's male guardian. The consensus leans toward the latter. The real harm, in their view, was social, not personal. If a woman was raped, it was her father's or husband's honour that had been tainted. If a man was raped, well, that just wasn't supposed to happen. And if it did, it became a joke, a scandal or an accusation. So as you walk through Rome tonight, you're not just seeing a city of temples and marble arches. You're walking through a place where power wasn't just flexed with armies or gold. It was carved into bodies, into punishments, into stories told over wine and under flickering lamps. You pass a group of boys play fighting in a courtyard. One pins the other, laughs, calls him muliebris, womanly. It's a game, but it isn't. It's a rehearsal, a tiny, terrifying performance of a society that taught its people. To be conquered is to be shamed, and shame, that's worse than death. In Rome, sex isn't just for pleasure. Sometimes it's for control, sometimes it's for spectacle, and sometimes it's just a brutal reminder of who owns the script, and who only gets to bleed in the margins. You need a breather, right? After all that blood and punishment, let's slip into a quieter room. It's early evening in Pompeii. The sky's gone soft and golden, and a gentle breeze rustles the cypress trees. You duck into a modest villa on the edge of town. Not one of the sprawling palaces, but still tasteful. As your eyes adjust to the indoor light, you notice something interesting. Painted on the wall, framed like a family portrait, is a vivid image. Two figures amid-embraced, legs tangled, faces flushed. It's not a religious scene. It's not a myth. It's sex on the wall. Welcome to Roman erotica. If you thought the ancient world was all stern marble busts and noble togas, think again. Romans loved their erotic art. They didn't hide it behind curtains or lock it in dusty vaults. They put it where guests could see it, right above a bed in a dining room alcove, even in the entryway. Why? Because for them, sexual imagery wasn't embarrassing. It was expected. It was part of life, like wine or olives or arguments about poetry. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Not every Roman home had a fresco of Aphrodite and a satyr doing the horizontal wrestling match above the salad bowl. But in wealthier or more relaxed households, especially in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, those warm southern cities that leaned hard into leisure, you'd absolutely find erotic images right alongside landscapes and mythological scenes. It was decoration, conversation starter, and maybe even, depending on who was visiting, a preview. Erotic art in Rome ran the gamut from romantic to ridiculous to, oh dear, that's anatomically ambitious. You'd see paintings of couples mid-act, sometimes tender, sometimes wild, sometimes involving multiple participants and the occasional strategically placed amphora. Then there were mosaics, tiny stone tiles forming sprawling bedroom scenes on floors. Imagine tiptoeing into a room and realising you're walking over a very detailed depiction of a threesome. That was just another Tuesday in Pompeii. And then, of course, there were the sculptures. One particularly infamous example, the statue of Pan having sex with a goat found in the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, is exactly what it sounds like, and the craftsmanship is disturbingly good. What's fascinating is that it wasn't hidden away, it was found in a garden, where it likely served as either a joke, a fertility charm, or both. Romans had a different relationship with taboo. They didn't have the same hang-ups about decency. To them, erotic images weren't shameful, they were functional, protective, even lucky. That brings us to the ubiquitous symbol of Roman sex and luck, the phallus. You see it everywhere, on wind chimes, door knockers, kilns, oil lamps, graffiti. They called it the faxinum, and it was believed to ward off the evil eye. Kids wore little gold or bone versions around their necks. It was less about desire and more about power, fertility and masculine energy. None were winged, some had legs, some even had multiple heads. And they weren't tucked out of sight. They were proudly displayed, pointing toward the street like a grinning gargoyle. You couldn't throw a stone in Pompeii without hitting a flying penis. So let's talk about Pompeii's Lupanar, the city's best preserved brothel. Inside you'll find tiny rooms with stone beds and, yes, erotic frescoes painted above each doorway. These weren't just random images, some scholars believe they were visual menus, showing what each sex worker specialised in. Can't read? No problem, just point to the picture. There's something painfully efficient about it. Imagine if your local diner had illustrated descriptions of every waitress's talents. And then there's the graffiti. Pompeii is covered in it, scratched into walls, carved into columns, inked on doors. Some is poetic, like, I kissed my girl behind this wall, while others are more direct. Successus loves Iris. May she spread her thighs for him. Charming, vulgar, very Roman. These were people who saw no reason to keep their desires quiet. They announced them like birthdays. Here's your fringe fact. Erotic art in Rome wasn't always heterosexual. There are depictions of male-male and female-female encounters, especially in private settings like bathhouses or pleasure gardens. They weren't necessarily political statements. They were part of a broader visual language of desire. Romans, as you've seen, didn't think about sexuality in binary terms. They thought in hierarchies, roles, and aesthetics. If it looked good and it felt good, paint it, celebrate it, hang it above the couch. That said, not everyone loved it. The more conservative elements of Roman society, especially during the Augustan period, started to grumble about the corruption of public morals. Augustus tried to clean up the city's image, and that included tamping down on erotic excess. Still, art is hard to legislate, and private homes continued to display their cheeky murals long after the official frowns began. Censorship never stands a chance against horny wall painters. Modern scholars still debate what exactly all this erotic art meant. Was it just decoration, a sexual prompt, a religious offering? Was the statue of Pan and the goat a fertility symbol, or just an elite's terrible sense of humour? Theories abound. Some say it helped prevent the evil eye. Others suggest it was tied to Dionysian rituals. A few believe it reflected an anxiety about masculinity, like Rome had to constantly prove it wasn't going soft. All of them might be true, or none. Roman art, like Roman sex, refuses to sit still. So tonight, you wander through the Villa of the Mysteries. The torches flicker on red-painted walls, the frescoes seem to shift in the corner of your vision, and every surface feels alive with suggestion. You pause in front of a small, beautifully rendered image. A man and woman in an intimate embrace, their expression serene. There's nothing lewd about it. It's gentle, even tender. The way her hand rests on his cheek, the way his eyes meet hers. You wonder if this was love, or fantasy, or just a reminder that sometimes, even in Rome, desire wasn't only about power. You step back into the night, the city humming quietly. Marble statues cast long shadows. Somewhere a wind chime jingles, a bronze phallus with tiny wings, spinning in the breeze. A charm, a joke, a warning. Rome tells its stories in stone and paint in silence. You just have to know where to look. You've just stepped out of a villa filled with artful mosaics and winged phalluses, but don't get too comfortable, because now you're heading somewhere a lot less elegant, a lot more chaotic, and definitely louder. Tonight, you're pulling up a stool at a smoky little tavern on the Aventine Hill, elbow to elbow with plebs, poets, sailors, and professional troublemakers. Why? Because this is where you'll find the true heart of Roman eroticism, not in murals or marble, but in words, specifically in poetry so filthy, so shameless, so hilariously unfiltered that you'll wonder how it got past the censor's knife. Welcome to the world of dirty Roman poetry. First off, you need to understand that poetry in Rome wasn't always highbrow. Sure, there were epic works about heroes and gods and empires, but there was also a whole other genre, short, vulgar, and very personal. These were the verses that got scratched into walls or recited at banquets after the wine had really started flowing. Poems about body parts, bad lovers, threesomes, prostitutes, flaccid senators, weird kinks, and of course endless complaints about how nobody does it like they used to. And the grand master of this beautifully crude universe? Catullus. Oh, Catullus. This guy makes modern rappers look subtle. Born in the 1st century BCE, Catullus wrote with a brutal honesty that somehow still manages to be romantic, hilarious, and grotesque all at once. He penned love poems to a woman he called Lesbia, who may or may not have been based on the real-life Clodia, a powerful aristocrat with a reputation for drama. He worships her, he hates her, he wants to kiss her 1,000 times and then 100 more. Then he wants her to die in a ditch. It's complicated. One poem in particular stands out for its sheer audacity. It's addressed to two rivals and begins with what is essentially the poetic version of, "You think I'm soft? Let me explain with anatomical detail exactly why you're wrong." He uses the Latin word irumabo, which, let's just say, is not something you'd want said about you in public. It means something very specific, very aggressive, and very oral. That poem is famous because it's both clever and unrelentingly obscene. It's like Catullus invented the diss track and the thirst trap in one breath. And then there's Martial, the king of the Roman epigram. Think Twitter, but angrier and hornier. Martial wrote hundreds of short, biting poems, some just a couple lines long, mocking anyone and everyone: bad lovers, greedy patrons, clueless senators, guys with suspiciously smooth legs, and women who were, shall we say, a bit too loud in bed. He coined the ultimate Roman insult formula: accuse a man of being too passive, too hairless, and too eager in bed, but only when it wasn't his turn. Here's one of Martial's favourite moves: calling out public figures with barely disguised pseudonyms and then accusing them of doing things with goats, children, or their own slaves. It wasn't even about truth, it was about performance. The more shocking the accusation, the better the laugh. Sex wasn't just a theme in his poetry, it was a weapon, a punchline, a form of social control. The worst thing you could be in Rome wasn't poor, it was ridiculous, and nothing made you more ridiculous than being sexually un-Roman. But these poets weren't writing in a vacuum. The audience loved this stuff. They read it out loud at parties, scratched it into bathroom walls, passed it around like juicy gossip. The educated elite might pretend to be offended, but they devoured every syllable. It's no coincidence that a huge number of these poems survived in the private libraries of the very men they mocked. Hypocrisy, Rome invented it. Here's your quirky nugget of knowledge. Some erotic poems were considered so scandalous that medieval monks who copied ancient texts often accidentally left them out. Others would scribble angry notes in the margins like, "This verse is obscene," while still dutifully writing it out in perfect calligraphy. Bless their conflicted little hearts. And it wasn't just men writing about sex. Sulpicia, one of the very few surviving female voices from the Roman world, wrote passionate, unashamed love poetry from a woman's point of view. She wasn't shy. She wrote about desire, about wanting, about not waiting for permission. "I'm not ashamed to write what I suffer," she declares in one poem. She was elite, educated, and daring enough to put her voice into a genre dominated by loud, bragging men. The fact that any of her work survived at all is a miracle. Scholars still argue about what to do with all this obscene poetry. Some say it's just entertainment, nothing to take seriously. Others believe it gives us a rare, uncensored glimpse into the emotional and erotic lives of real Romans. Did they really talk like this? Probably, at least some of them did. Were these poems always autobiographical? Not necessarily, but they were authentic to something: desire, insecurity, power, performance. That's what makes them endure. So here you are, sitting in this smoky little tavern, wine cup in hand, listening to a young poet recite a new verse. The crowd laughs, someone slaps the table, someone else spits wine through their nose, the poet bows. Then he starts another, and it's somehow even filthier. You catch a few words, something about a senator's backside and a missing chicken. You don't get it all, but the energy is infectious. This isn't high art, it's alive. It's Rome. And outside, the city keeps breathing, its alleyways full of whispered verses, its walls tattooed with declarations of love and lust, its people unashamed to mix sex with satire. Because in Rome, your body wasn't just a source of pleasure, it was a source of poetry, of mockery, of meaning. The poet lifts his cup in your direction. You nod, not quite sure what you've just heard, but knowing somehow that it's exactly the kind of history that never makes it into the textbooks. You're standing at the foot of Palatine Hill now, and the streets feel a little more polished, a little quieter. Fewer cackling poets, fewer suggestive graffiti scribbled on the walls. This is imperial territory, the marble heart of Roman power, where the emperors live, rule, and sometimes indulge, because if you thought the private citizens of Rome had messy love lives, just wait until you peek behind the curtains of the palace. Tonight you're slipping into the scandal-ridden bedrooms of the emperors, where sex isn't just personal, it's propaganda, performance and sometimes pure madness. Start with the poster child of imperial excess, Caligula. Oh, Caligula. The man who allegedly tried to make his horse a consul also made the entire city of Rome collectively raise its eyebrows with his sex life. Ancient historians claim he turned the palace into a brothel, forced noblewomen to serve his friends, and slept with his own sisters. Now, before you go full tabloid, know that some of these stories were likely exaggerated. Roman historians weren't above sensationalism. Still, there's enough smoke here to suggest at least a smouldering fire. Caligula's rule was short, chaotic, and soaked in both blood and rumour. And at the centre of many of those rumours? Sex. His uncle Claudius looked like the safe, bookish follow-up, until you met his wife, Messalina. Ah yes, Messalina, possibly the most slandered woman in Roman history. Tacitus and Suetonius paint her as a nymphomaniac who competed with prostitutes in all-night contests to see who could bed the most men. The number allegedly reached 25 in a single evening. Whether that's possible or just wildly misogynistic storytelling is up for debate. But the point is clear. Messalina became a symbol, a cautionary tale about female sexual power left unchecked, a woman whose appetite supposedly outmatched an empire's ability to contain her. Then there's Nero. If Caligula was chaos and Claudius was caution, Nero was sheer operatic drama. He had lovers of all genders, murdered his own mother, and staged elaborate public performances, sometimes dressed as a woman, sometimes playing the role of a bride. He married a freedman named Pythagoras in a public ceremony, where Nero played the bride, complete with veil and vows. Then he married another young man named Sporus, and had him publicly addressed as Empress. The detail that's often whispered, but rarely printed, is that Sporus was likely castrated to better fulfill the role. This was not love, this was theatre, and cruelty, and power. You might be asking, did the Roman people care? Did anyone throw tomatoes at Nero for cross-dressing or marrying men? Surprisingly, not really. The scandals came less from the gender stuff and more from the perception of losing control. A Roman man could sleep with whom he liked, as long as he remained dominant, strong and proper. Nero's flamboyant public antics, singing arias in the theatre, racing chariots and playing bride, made him look ridiculous, and ridicule in Rome was fatal. Being feared was fine, being laughed at. That was the beginning of the end. It's worth noting that many of these imperial sex scandals come from hostile sources, senators, moralists, historians with axes to grind. We don't have the emperor's diaries. We have the gossip, the political hit pieces, the bitter poems, so we can't always separate fact from fantasy. But that fantasy still tells us something real. It tells us what Romans feared, what they envied, what they couldn't stop talking about. And sometimes the sex wasn't about indulgence, it was about strategy. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, famously enforced moral laws across the empire while maintaining an image of pristine family virtue. But even he had to wrestle with a scandalous daughter, Julia, who flouted every expectation of feminine modesty. She was witty, popular, and according to gossip, very sexually active. Augustus exiled her to a barren island for it, not because she broke the law, but because she broke the image. The emperor could survive political plots, but not a daughter who turned his whole moral campaign into a punchline. Here's a fringe fact for you. Emperor Elagabalus, barely in his teens when he took power, was said to have married multiple men, dressed in women's clothing, and once offered a fortune to any physician who could surgically give him female genitalia. Was it true? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that Roman historians wrote it down with such much horror suggests it wasn't the sexuality that scared them. It was the blurring of identity, the refusal to stay in a box. For an emperor to act un-Roman in the bedroom was one thing. To rewrite the rules of gender, that was anarchy. So what did all this mean for the empire? Did the sexual escapades of emperors actually change anything? In some ways, yes. An emperor's personal life was a public issue. His behaviour set the tone, shaped legislation, and fueled political opposition. If he was seen as decadent, his enemies could rally behind morality. If he was too prudish, he might lose the support of the pleasure-loving elite. It was a tightrope, and the bedroom was always part of the balancing act. Scholars continue to debate the accuracy of these tales. Some argue that the ancient sources were so biased and obsessed with scandal that they've distorted the historical record beyond repair. Others believe the sheer consistency of certain details, multiple writers, similar timelines, points to some truth. Either way, the stories endured, and that endurance itself tells us what Rome couldn't stop obsessing over. As you walk the marble corridors of the Palatine Palace, You try to imagine it as it once was, full of silks and secrets, guards and gossip. You pass a closed door and wonder what scenes played out behind it. Was it a quiet moment of affection between two lovers? A violent display of power? A ritual? A trap? The palace walls don't speak, but the whispers echo down the centuries. In the world of emperors, sex wasn't about connection. It was about image, about dominance, about writing your own mythology in flesh and rumour. And if history's any indication, sometimes the most lasting legacies weren't written in stone, but in scandal. Now that you've wandered through the wild bedrooms of emperors, it's time to step into a very different kind of sacred space. One that's silent, disciplined, and lit by the flicker of ritual fire. Tonight, you're crossing the threshold of the Temple of Vesta, home to Rome's most revered and most controlled women, the Vestal Virgins. You won't find velvet couches or flying phalluses here. You'll find stillness, modesty, and a terrifying kind of purity, because for the Vestals, sex wasn't just forbidden, it was a potential death sentence. Let's start with the basics. The Vestal Virgins were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Her flame burning in the centre of Rome symbolised the eternal life of the city itself. And the women who guarded that flame? They weren't just lighting lamps, they were living icons, national treasures wrapped in white linen and silence. To become a Vestal, a girl had to be chosen between the ages of 6 and 10, plucked from a noble family, healthy, whole, with 2 living parents, and, of course, a virgin. She was taken from her family and brought to the Atrium Vestae, where she'd live for the next 30 years under the supervision of the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. Her vow of chastity wasn't symbolic. It was law. She was expected to remain untouched, sexually and otherwise, for the full duration of her service. Now here's where it gets intense. The first 10 years were for training, the next 10 for active duty, tending the sacred fame, preparing ritual offerings, overseeing public ceremonies. The final 10, teaching the next generation of girls. After those 30 years, she was free to marry, to leave, to start a new life. But most didn't. Why? Because by then, the world had changed around them. They were priestesses turned ghosts, too sacred to touch, too alien to approach. But while Vestals were revered, their role came with heavy chains. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, or even if she was merely accused, the punishment was horrifying. Roman law forbade spilling the blood of a Vestal, so they found a loophole: live burial. She'd be led in solemn procession to a chamber dug beneath the city, given a tiny lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and then sealed underground. Officially, they weren't killing her, they were just letting the gods decide. Right. Let's stop and absorb that. Ancient Rome created an entire institution of women whose worth was tied to their perfect sexual restraint, and whose single failure was punished with the slowest, loneliest death imaginable. And here's the real kicker. There were times when the state wanted to punish a Vestal. During periods of political upheaval, a scandal involving a priestess could serve as a scapegoat, a way to claim divine wrath was the reason for drought or plague. Vestals, once untouchable, could suddenly become very touchable targets. There's a particularly chilling case from 114 BCE, when 4 Vestals were accused of unchastity. 1 was acquitted, 3 were convicted, and at least 2 were buried alive. The men accused of sleeping with them? Flogged, fined, or exiled standard. You see the imbalance, right? The idea wasn't just to enforce morality, it was to weaponize it, to keep women obedient by offering the most extreme cautionary tale. Don't step out of line or we'll put you in a box and forget you existed. But, and this is where Roman paradox strikes again, Vestals also had privileges other women could only dream of. They could own property, they could make wills, they could testify in court, they had special seats at the theatre. They were escorted by lictors, those bodyguard types who usually only served male magistrates. And if a Vestal touched a condemned man as he was being led to execution, his sentence could be commuted. She had literal life and death veto power with just a touch. Not bad for someone who wasn't allowed to flirt. Here's your fringe fact. During public festivals, Vestals were sometimes allowed to ride in a chariot, a right denied to virtually every other Roman woman. Imagine that. 10,000 people watching you glide past, draped in layers of pristine linen, your head covered, your hands folded. You are the embodiment of Roman virtue, power in silence. And yet everyone knows. You didn't choose this. You were chosen, a living symbol of discipline, sacrifice, and public property. The irony, of course, is that the Vestals were sexualized precisely because of their chastity. The more forbidden they were, the more fascination they inspired. Poets wrote about their beauty. Rumours swirled any time one even looked too long at a man. They were like the original untouchables, sacred but suspicious, revered but relentlessly watched. And scholars today still wrestle with how to read their legacy. Were they empowered women given unique authority in a male-dominated world? Or were they prisoners in white groomed from childhood to serve a public myth of feminine perfection? Some argue they were both, a paradox Rome loved to cultivate. Powerful but never free, honoured but entirely controlled. One of the more haunting interpretations comes from feminist historians who point out that Vestals existed primarily to make other Roman women feel like their own cages were comfortable. Compared to the impossible standards of the Vestals, being a wife, a mother, even a prostitute seemed almost liberating. Vestals were the warning, the sacred sacrifice that kept the rest of society in line. As you walk past the ruins of their temple, just columns now, scattered and sunlit, you can almost hear the soft shuffle of sandaled feet, a flicker of white at the edge of your vision, the cold scent of ash and incense. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you imagine what it must have been like to be 10 years old and told, you belong to the goddess now. Your body, your future, your desires, they're not yours anymore. You might have smiled, you might have felt pride, but that pride, it came with a key that only locked from the outside. Rome liked to say its power came from discipline, that its virtue came from purity, and the Vestals, they were the proof. Living reminders that the city could control even its most primal urges, that it could take something wild, like a woman, and make it sacred through silence. But the flame had to keep burning, and if you let it go out, even once, it wasn't just your life on the line, it was the city's. Tonight, we're turning the handle on one of ancient Rome's most intriguing doors, the kind that leads to steam, sweat, and a whole lot of naked bodies. You've just stepped into the Roman Thermae, the public bathhouse. But don't let the word bath fool you into thinking it's just about hygiene. This place is a buzzing, body-packed arena where politics, business, gossip, grooming, and sex all swirled together in a thick cloud of perfumed humidity. It's part spa, part gym, part social media feed, and part low-grade erotic free-for-all. Welcome to the Roman baths, where everyone's towel is a little too small and personal boundaries are more of a suggestion. First, let's get oriented. A typical bath complex, like the famous baths of Caracalla or the smaller neighbourhood versions, had a standard flow. You'd start in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you'd strip down and hand your clothes to an attendant or slave. Already the stage is set. Everyone's naked, everyone's visible, and everyone's watching, because in Rome the body was public currency. You were judged by your skin, your scars, your posture, your tan. A soft belly could mean wealth. Too many blemishes might scream illness or vice. Every inch of you was data. From there you'd move into the tepidarium, a warm chamber to ease you in, then the caldarium, the hot room, like a sauna. Steam rises, oil and sweat glisten on shoulders. There are wooden benches, stone basins, and attendants walking around with long curved scrapers, strigils, to remove the oil and dirt from your skin. You're surrounded by men of all ranks. Senators, merchants, students, retired soldiers. Everyone's the same height when they're sweating in the nude. But now let's talk about what really happens here. Because for all its talk of health and wellness, the Roman bathhouse was a deeply sensual place. No, it wasn't officially a brothel. Yes, women and men usually bathed at different times or in separate spaces, though that rule was occasionally bent depending on the emperor's mood. But the environment, it was ripe with possibility. Secret glances, accidental brushes, invitations whispered over the sound of pouring water. It wasn't uncommon for sex workers to hang around the bathhouse, offering their services just outside or even inside certain corners of the complex. Some attendants, particularly young and attractive ones, became favourites of elite patrons. A little extra coin, a lingering look, and suddenly the line between servant and lover blurred. Bathhouse hookups weren't advertised, but they weren't exactly hidden either. There's even ancient graffiti to prove it. In one bathhouse in Pompeii, someone carved a charming note into the wall. Apollinaris the medic was here with his girlfriend, the prostitute Eutychus. She was very good. It's a Yelp review, basically, with fewer stars, more enthusiasm, and definitely more context than anyone asked for. Let's not forget that Romans were wildly obsessed with bodily perfection. The bathhouse became a sort of erotic theatre, where everyone played both spectator and actor. Men strutted, flexed, compared. Women, when allowed, bathed together, gossiped, and probably judged each other's fashion choices even in the nude. Young men were especially scrutinised. Smooth skin, lean muscles, no beard yet. Erotic poets frequently described bathhouse scenes full of stolen glimpses and quiet longing. It was socially understood that the baths weren't just for washing off sweat, they were for soaking in attention. And here's your quirky fringe fact of the night. Some Roman bathhouses had vending machines. Well, kind of. You'd drop in a coin and receive a little token, a tessera, that you could exchange for services like massages, snacks, or less publicly listed amenities. Archaeologists have found tesserae with suggestive imagery that hint not so subtly at sexual transactions. So yes, Rome invented the ancient version of the locker room hookup coin. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this. Moralists like Seneca and Pliny the Elder occasionally grumbled about how the baths were becoming dens of sin, moisture-filled temples of vice, if you will. They didn't love the co-ed experiments under emperors like Elagabalus, who famously lifted restrictions and let men and women bathe together. These same critics lamented the softening of Roman men, who instead of doing manly things like stabbing each other on the battlefield, now spent afternoons exfoliating and flirting in hot tubs. Scholars still debate just how sexual the baths really were. Some insist they were mostly innocent spaces, with the occasional naughty detour. Others argue that sexuality was so baked into the Roman worldview that even a routine scrub down had layers of erotic charge. And honestly, both arguments hold water, much like the cisterns beneath the bathhouse floor. It likely depended on the location, the time of day, the clientele, and whether you were in the mood for conversation, confrontation, or companionship. As you wander through the echoing stone corridors of a bath complex, your footsteps softened by dripping water, you begin to notice the subtle choreography of the space. The way certain alcoves curve just out of view. The way laughter bounces off the walls, blending with the splash of ladles and the whisper of skin on stone. There's something almost hypnotic about it. You could get lost here, washed clean, yes, but also unmoored. Who are you without your clothes, your social rank, your armour? You glance across the caldarium. A young man leans against the edge of the pool watching you. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just the steam playing tricks. Maybe it's the wine from earlier. Maybe it's Rome reminding you that desire doesn't always knock. Sometimes it just winks and vanishes into the mist. Later, as you exit the bath and feel the cool evening air wrap around your damp skin, you realise you're not quite the same. Not dirtier, not cleaner. Just more aware of your body, of others, of how close proximity and heat and vulnerability can melt walls you didn't even know were there. In Rome, even a simple bath could be a stage. You've towel-dried and stepped back onto Rome's dusty streets, but you're not done learning yet, not by a long shot. Because while the bathhouses may have been Rome's favourite erotic playgrounds, the city had another resource for those in need of bedroom guidance. Sex manuals. Yes, actual advice literature. Rome wasn't just doing the deed, they were thinking about it, writing about it, and trying to codify it into something resembling an art form. Tonight, you're opening up the Roman equivalent of a Kama Sutra, and let's just say, it's less tantric enlightenment and more, here's how not to die of boredom in bed. Now, full disclosure. We don't have a neat, leather-bound Roman sex manual with chapters and diagrams. What we have are fragments, poems, letters, treatises, and medical texts, all stitched together by scholars and armchair historians bound to reveal an oddly comprehensive, occasionally absurd, and sometimes deeply charming record of how the Romans thought sex should go down. Or up, or sideways, depending on preference. Let's start with Ovid, Rome's smooth-talking, sarcasm-drenched love guru. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was less a sex manual and more a complete dating strategy for men. And later, women, part poetry, part handbook, part satire. It taught readers how to find a lover, seduce them, keep them interested, and when necessary move on without crying in public. Ovid gives tips on where to meet women, the theatre naturally, how to flatter them, compare her eyes to stars but never her breath, and which positions suggest once things got horizontal. But here's the twist. Ars Amatoria is wildly contradictory. One moment it's telling men to be gentle and poetic, the next it's joking about slipping into a girl's bed during a party blackout. Some historians read it as sincere advice, others as satire, a parody of the pickup artist before there were podcasts and overpriced cologne. Either way, the Roman government didn't love it. Augustus, yes, that guy again, was so unimpressed he exiled Ovid to the edges of the empire, officially for a poem and a mistake. Many believe Ars Amatoria was the poem, and the mistake was possibly helping the emperor's daughter get a little too friendly with her lovers. While Ovid handled seduction, other Roman texts focused more on the actual mechanics. Ancient medical writers like Galen and Soranus, whose names really do sound like magic school professors, wrote about intercourse, anatomy, and how to keep your partner interested and alive. Soranus's gynecology is particularly fascinating. It covers everything from contraception to how often women should have sex for health. His advice, not too much, not too little, just enough to keep the uterus happy. Yes, the uterus had moods in Roman medical theory. According to some doctors, if left unfulfilled, it could wander around the body and cause hysteria. This was not fringe science at the time. This was mainstream. Another popular belief was that orgasms were necessary for conception. Both partners needed to climax for pregnancy to occur, or so said Hippocrates and his Roman fan club. This gave women a medical excuse at least to request more effort. You can almost picture a Roman wife saying, "No, seriously, Quintus, it's for the baby." As for positions, the Romans didn't exactly shy away from that topic either. While we don't have a Joy of Sex style illustrated guide, we do have enough references to know they had preferences and opinions. The standard missionary position was considered respectable, ideal for conception and morally upright. Rear entry was acceptable but associated more with animalistic urges and occasionally linked to dominance over lower status partners. Cowgirl, yes, that existed, was sometimes praised for allowing female pleasure, but also warned against for being too empowering. One poet even claims that women on the top were more likely to fake pleasure, so basically the same debate forums as today, just with more togas. Here's your quirky historical nugget. Some Romans believed certain positions could reshape a baby's features in the womb. Want a son with strong arms? Better face north and angle your hips during conception. Want a child with curls? Wait until a thunderstorm and try under a fig tree. None of this had any scientific basis, of course, but it's endearing in a slightly unhinged way. Who among us hasn't tried something weird because an article told us it boosted passion? Roman sex advice also carried a heavy load of class and gender assumptions. Men were always assumed to be the active partner, both physically and socially. Women were supposed to be receptive, coy and grateful, but also skilled enough to keep a man's attention. That contradiction played out constantly in advice literature. She should pretend not to want it, but also moan convincingly when it starts. Be mysterious, but also predictable. Be sexy, but not sexually assertive unless you're Greek or a courtesan. The advice for men? Stay in control. Don't get too emotional. Don't fall in love with your slave. Definitely don't get attached to an actress, unless you want your friends to laugh at you in the baths. And if you finish too quickly, well, maybe eat fewer lentils. Even the gods got in on the action. Priapus, the god of gardens and perpetual erections, yes, he existed, was a recurring figure in Roman erotic poetry and sculpture. He was often depicted in gardens with an absurdly over-innocent phallus, meant to scare off thieves and maybe excite the occasional houseguest. He became a sort of folk mascot for virility, and jokes about him made the rounds in poems, jokes, and even advice columns of the time. But while these ancient sex guides were filled with recommendations and rituals, they all danced around one thing: intimacy, that elusive spark, the emotional undercurrent. Roman sex advice was deeply mechanical, more interested in performance and outcome than connection. Love was rare, pleasure was expected. But vulnerability, that wasn't part of the curriculum. And yet, between the lines, you get glimpses: Ovid's sighs, Sulpicia's confessions, the graffiti that reads more like longing than lust. Maybe they didn't write about intimacy because they were too busy trying to control it. Maybe real desire couldn't be diagrammed. As you close the metaphorical scroll for the night, you can't help but laugh. The questions haven't changed that much. What works? What doesn't? What do they like? What does this mean? The details differ. But the curiosity? Eternal. Like the city that once believed if you got the angle just right, you could make a god of your child. Rome never stopped trying to get it right, and neither have we. Tonight, we're slipping into the twilight zone of Roman intimacy, the shadowy territory where sex meets superstition and love gets tangled up in curses, charms, and ancient kitchen magic. If you thought modern dating had some sketchy life hacks, buckle up. Because ancient Romans were out here grinding bones, boiling herbs, muttering invocations at crossroads, and tying knots in thread soaked in body fluids just to make someone fall in love, or at least stay the night. This wasn't subtle. This was desperate, smoky, and wonderfully theatrical. Welcome to the world of Roman love magic, where passion wasn't left to chance, it was conjured. Let's start with a question. What do you do if you're in love in ancient Rome, but the object of your affection isn't returning the vibe? You could write a poem, you could show up at their door with figs and flattery. And if you're feeling particularly intense and a little unhinged, you could visit a local saga, a wise woman, herbalist, or full-blown sorceress, and ask for a spell. Romans didn't draw hard lines between science, medicine, and magic. If it worked, it was useful. If it was spooky and dramatic, even better. The most common magical love tools? Defictionis lead curse tablets. These were thin sheets of lead or pewter inscribed with tightly packed lines of text, often calling on underworld gods or spirits to bind, torment, or seduce a particular person. Some were buried in graves, others thrown into wells or nailed to temple walls. You'd read things like, "May Julia feel burning desire for Marcus and be unable to eat, sleep, or see other men until she comes to him." The language is raw, obsessive, and sometimes disturbingly poetic. These spells weren't just about affection, they were about control and maybe even domination. You can still read these tablets today because they've survived in hundreds. One chilling example says, "Bind her soul, heart, buttocks, liver, and mind." That's right, the buttocks. We love a man with specific goals. Love charms also involved physical tokens, hair, nail clippings, bits of clothing, or in extreme cases, bodily fluids. A lover might hide a personal item under the threshold of a crush's home or mix something special into their drink. These weren't metaphors. Ingredients could include menstrual blood, semen, or animal organs. That wine you just accepted at the Saturnalia party? Yeah, might want to pour that out. Then there were amulets, small carvings or jewellery pieces worn close to the body. Some were phallic, others shaped like hearts, hands, or eyes. Many were inscribed with cryptic phrases like abracadabra or hocus pocus, which might sound silly now but carried real weight in ancient Rome. These weren't just sounds, they were incantations, often borrowed from foreign traditions. Egyptian, Greek, Syrian. The Romans loved importing exotic magic, especially if it's promised to solve matters of the heart. Or loins. One fascinating ritual involved binding figurines. Picture this. You carve two tiny dolls, one to represent yourself, one your desired lover. You tie them together with red thread, sometimes binding the wrists, sometimes placing one figure on top of the other. You chant, you call on Venus or underworld spirits, or even obscure local deities. Then you bury the figures in a graveyard or crossroads and wait. It's like Build-A-Bear meets necromancy. And here's your fringe fact. Some Roman love spells included instructions to melt her heart like wax, followed by the literal melting of a wax figurine in a fire or under the sun. It's wonderfully dramatic. You can practically hear the violins. As this wax dissolves, so too shall her resistance. Theatrical? Absolutely. Effective? Debatable. But what if you weren't trying to attract someone? What if you were trying to keep them? That's where magical contraception and potions came in. Roman women were no strangers to herbal knowledge, and many used potions both to encourage desire and to prevent pregnancy. Pomegranate, penny, royal, silphium, an extinct plant so valued for its contraceptive properties it was literally harvested to oblivion. Love magic wasn't just about seduction, it was about survival. Of course, not everyone approved. Male writers in Rome loved mocking women who dabbled in magic. They painted them as hysterical, manipulative, even demonic. Horace describes an old witch named Canidia brewing potions with owl feathers and unbaptized babies. Don't worry, he was probably being dramatic. These women became scapegoats, symbols of everything Rome feared about female power. Because what's scarier to a rigidly patriarchal society than a woman who knows how to make a man love her, or curse him when he leaves? That double standard persisted everywhere. Men casting love spells. A bit desperate, sure, but understandable. Women doing the same? Witches, monsters, seductresses with too much autonomy and not enough shame. Never mind that love magic almost always targeted women's hearts or bodies, as if they were puzzles to be unlocked with the right whispered charm. There's still a fierce scholarly debate around how seriously Romans took all this. Were these spells performed by desperate lovers, or were they just symbolic, psychological tricks to boost confidence and manifest romance? Some researchers argue that love magic was a form of ritualized therapy. Others see it as real spiritual practice. Either way, the emotional charge behind these spells is undeniable. Whether or not they believed the magic worked, the longing was real. And then there's the matter of ethics. You read those spells, and you feel a strange mix of empathy and unease. The person casting the spell is often in pain, lonely, heartbroken, yearning. But the way they speak about the object of their affection is not always romantic. Sometimes it's possessive, even cruel. Make her tremble, burn, suffer until she comes to me. That's not a love poem. That's an emotional hostage situation with a side of necromancy. So tonight, as you walk past the Temple of Venus, you imagine the quiet shadows around it. Not just lovers stealing kisses, but someone crouching in the dark, bearing a lead tablet, whispering names into the dirt, a strand of hair tied in a red knot, a clay doll clutched to a trembling chest. Love in Rome wasn't always flowers and poetry. Sometimes it was desperation. Sometimes it was control, and sometimes it was just one more thing the gods might or might not answer. You keep walking, and in the corner of your mind you wonder who might be whispering your name into the soil right now. Let's take a breath. We've walked through some of Rome's darkest corridors, and now we land somewhere quieter, but no less complicated. Tonight, you're sitting beside a Roman woman in her late 20s. Her name is Livia, or perhaps Antonia, or maybe something lost to time. She's well kept but pale, and the way she folds her hands in her lap tells you something's wrong. She's had 3 pregnancies in 4 years. 1 child died, 1 was given to a wet nurse, and the third, well, she's not sure yet. What she is sure of is that she can't go through this again. And so in a whispered conversation behind a shaded column, she asks a friend where to find a certain herb, one that might solve her problem. This is birth control, Roman style, raw, risky, and always whispered. If you think reproductive health is a modern battlefield, think again. Roman women lived in a world with no ultrasounds, no legal protections, no sterile clinics. But they had knowledge. Herbal wisdom passed from midwives, whispered from grandmothers, etched into texts by physicians like Serenus, who, you'll remember, was Rome's unofficial gynecologist. And much of that knowledge was about how to avoid pregnancy, not just how to survive it. So how did they do it? Start with the star of the ancient contraceptive world, silphium. This now extinct plant was so prized for its alleged fertility-blocking properties that it was literally harvested into oblivion. Native to Cyrene, modern Libya, silphium was shaped like fennel and apparently did everything. Cured coughs, seasoned food, and most importantly, acted as both contraceptive and abortifacient. Roman women chewed it, brewed it into teas, even inserted the resin vaginally. It was so valuable that its image appeared on coins. One Roman naturalist, Pliny the Elder, noted that a single stalk was once gifted to Emperor Nero as a diplomatic gesture. That's how high the stakes were. But when silphium ran out, somewhere around the 1st century CE, women turned to other options. Herbs like pennyroyal, myrrh, rue, and Queen Anne's lace were widely known for their use in reproductive control. Many of these acted as emmenagogues, substances that stimulated menstruation, which in a world without pregnancy tests often meant flushing out an unwanted conception. And yes, some worked, and some were toxic. Midwives or obstetresses were the gatekeepers of this knowledge. They weren't just birth assistants, they were pharmacists, counsellors, abortionists, and sometimes miracle workers. A skilled midwife could tell by touch how far along a pregnancy was, She could mix a potion that would make a woman bleed. She could use warmed oils, special massages, or, more dangerously, instruments made of bone or bronze. Nothing was sterile. Everything came with risk. But these women understood the stakes better than anyone. Now let's address the hard truth. Abortion was not illegal in Rome, at least not the way we think of it. There were no laws against terminating a pregnancy, unless the child was wanted by the father. That was the line. If a woman took action to end a pregnancy against her husband's will, she could be charged with harming his property, not her body, his legacy. That tells you exactly where the legal system stood, and this legal logic extended to birth itself. An unborn child wasn't a person under Roman law. A fetus had no legal status until it drew breath, which means abortion wasn't seen as murder, it was seen as destruction of potential. Cold? Maybe, but it also gave Roman women a sliver of autonomy, if they knew how to navigate the risks. But who had access to this knowledge? Mostly upper-class women. The wealthy could afford skilled midwives, imported herbs, private care. Poor women, especially slaves, had fewer options. A pregnancy could mean punishment, sale, or forced separation from their child. And contraception, that was a luxury item. There's an inscription from the tomb of a freedwoman named Julia Philomene. It says she was a midwife of many years and knew the secrets of Venus. That's the Roman way of saying she dealt in sex, birth, and everything in between. She was probably both revered and feared, a woman whose hands could bring life or end it. A quiet power. Here's your strange but telling fringe fact. Some Roman women used amulets or charms to prevent conception. One popular talisman was an etched piece of carnelian worn around the neck or the thigh, engraved with prayers to Venus or obscure fertility spirits. Did it work? Probably not, but when your other options involved boiling roux or risking hemorrhage, a little magical insurance felt better than nothing. And speaking of options, some Roman men were also in on the game. Certain physicians recommended avoiding intercourse during specific phases of the moon or after large meals. Others suggested coitus interruptus. Yes, the withdrawal method existed. And then there were male contraceptives made from animal products like oiled goat bladders. Crude, but a forerunner to the modern condom. Still, most responsibility fell on women. If something went wrong, she was blamed. That's the unspoken truth of Roman reproductive life. It was a woman's burden. She was expected to produce children, but not too many. Be desirable, but not dangerously fertile. Remain modest, but manage her body like a strategist. If she succeeded, she was praised. If she failed, well, failure had many definitions, and few of them were fair. Scholars argue about how widespread these practices really were. Some say herbal contraception was common knowledge, others believe it was rare and unreliable. But either way, the cultural anxiety around it was real. Male writers constantly accused women of using herbs to cheat fertility. Some even suggested that sexual pleasure itself was suspicious, too much, and a woman might be using tricks. Too little, and she was probably infertile. It was a no-win scenario, and yet Roman women kept trying. They whispered, they shared recipes, they paid midwives under the table. They did what they had to do to survive in a world that didn't really care if childbirth killed them. Because here's the part Rome didn't write into its laws. Pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth could rupture, bleed, infect. A second or third pregnancy could be a death sentence. And without access to modern medicine, not getting pregnant was the best healthcare they had. So tonight, you pass a small apothecary tucked between two villas. A woman stands in the doorway, stirring something in a copper pot. The scent is sharp, mint, and something bitter. She glances up at you, then back down at the steam rising from her brew. Inside, a girl waits silently, her hand on her belly. No tears, just decision. You walk on, and you understand. Rome loved control. But even in its tightest grip, women carved out small spaces of power. Secret, fragile, real. We're drawing closer to the end now. And Rome itself is starting to shift. The columns still stand, the senators still argue, and the bathhouses still hum with gossip. But something is changing beneath the marble. A new ideology is stirring in dusty alleyways and candle-lit catacombs. One that doesn't celebrate lust, but condemns it. One that doesn't drape phalluses over doorways, but whispers of sin, purity, and divine punishment. Tonight, you're witnessing a transformation. When sex in Rome began to shed its freedom, wrap itself in shame, and slowly become a matter of salvation. This is the rise of Christianity, and with it, the beginning of Rome's great sexual retreat. To really feel this shift, you have to rewind just a bit. For centuries, Rome's attitude towards sex had been pragmatic. Pleasure wasn't sinful, it was strategic. Sex wasn't private, it was political, social, symbolic. Whether in temples, homes, or literature, eroticism was part of the public conversation. Sure, there were boundaries, class, power, gender, roles, but desire itself wasn't the enemy. That is, until this strange new religion began to gain traction. A faith built not on indulgence but on restraint. A faith that redefined sex as something dangerous, sacred, and deeply, deeply personal. Early Christianity didn't just show up and immediately start wagging fingers. At first, it was a movement of the marginalised. Slaves, women, the poor. People who had little say in the existing Roman sexual order. It offered a radical alternative. The idea that your body was not a public object, not a tool of empire or a possession of your master or husband, but a temple, something private, protected, holy. For a Roman woman, especially one forced into sexual roles as a slave or courtesan, that message hit hard. You mean I can say no? You mean I'm allowed to belong to myself? Christianity didn't erase the trauma of sexual exploitation, but it offered a framework to reimagine it. Virginity became not just a legal status, but a spiritual virtue. Celibacy, once considered odd or antisocial, was elevated into divine discipline. And so, quietly at first, the Christian vision of sexuality began to chip away at the Roman model. The gods of desire, Venus, Priapus, Bacchus, started to look less like protectors and more like threats. Their statues still stood, but their temples grew quiet. Instead, people gathered in underground chapels to hear letters from Paul, who famously advised believers to abstain from fornication and treat their bodies as instruments of righteousness. Better to marry than to burn, he warned. Not exactly romantic, but definitely influential. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 4th century CE, the mood in Rome had changed. The empire was fraying at the edges, politically unstable, economically shaky, morally uncertain. Christianity offered order. A clear map. Don't drink too much, don't sleep around, don't worship stone idols with weird anatomy, and, crucially, safe sex for marriage. One man, one woman, no games, no goddesses, no graffiti. And the state liked that. Because order was Rome's first language. So emperors began to promote Christian moral codes as a way to stabilise society. Laws were passed banning same-sex marriage, criminalising adultery more strictly, and restricting public nudity. The bathhouses, once a playground of bodies and gossip, were now increasingly gender-segregated and more strictly policed. Statues of nude gods were quietly tucked away. Erotic poems fell out of fashion. The bawdy wall scribbles of Pompeii became artefacts instead of trends. That's not to say Rome suddenly became a continent of prudes. People didn't just stop having sex, but how they talked about it, how they thought about it, started to change. Sex was no longer something to be celebrated publicly. It was something to be managed privately, monitored, confessed, redeemed. Here's your strange little fringe fact. One of the earliest Christian sex manuals was written by Clement of Alexandria around 200 CE. In it, he warned against excessive movement during intercourse, advised married couples to avoid sex during the day, and suggested that the ideal Christian bedroom was one in which the lights were off and the conversation was sparse. Spontaneity, taboo, passion, distracting. And as for pleasure, tolerated, barely, but only if it resulted in children. Otherwise, why were you even doing that? This attitude slowly made its way into law, liturgy, and architecture. The once vivid murals of lovers embracing were painted over with sombre saints. The playful mosaics in the baths gave way to stern marble inscriptions about virtue and discipline. And women who once served as priestesses of erotic goddesses were now urged to cover themselves, keep silent, and aim for modesty above all. Of course, not everyone embraced this shift. Pagans didn't just vanish. Roman sexual culture didn't flip overnight. There was resistance, blending, overlap. Some wealthy families hedged their bets, offering sacrifices at Venus's temple one day, attending Christian sermons the next. The old world didn't go down without a fight, but it did begin to fade. And for many women and slaves, this new sexual order was a double-edged sword. Yes, it theoretically protected them from being used, objectified or bought, but it also placed their value squarely on purity. Virginity became currency again, only now it was spiritual. To be violated was to be spiritually damaged. To be unmarried and sexually active was to risk damnation. In trying to clean up Rome's bedroom, Christianity replaced one hierarchy with another. Scholars today debate whether this moral shift was liberating or limiting. Some argue that Christianity gave women a voice and an identity beyond sex, especially those who joined monastic life or chose celibacy over forced marriage. Others point out that it reinforced a shame-based model of sexuality that has echoed painfully for centuries. One thing is certain: Christianity didn't erase Roman sexual culture. It absorbed it, transformed it, and in doing so laid the groundwork for how the Western world would view sex for the next 2,000 years. As you walk through the Forum now, you see both worlds layered atop one another. Columns of Venus beside a new stone church. A headless statue once known for its curves now missing its plaque. A merchant's daughter wrapped in linen, crossing herself as she passes a faded fresco of Priapus that no one dares to repaint. Rome is still Rome, but the way it loves, the way it sins, the way it forgives, it's different now. Desire has gone underground. Passion wears a robe and speaks in whispers, and somewhere under layers of incense and doctrine, the old gods are watching, smirking maybe, or just waiting. You're still in Rome, but something feels different, like the empire has exhaled and turned its gaze outward. The streets are filled with silks, spices, and voices speaking languages you don't recognize. Traders arrive from the Levant, Egypt, even distant India, bringing goods, stories, and new ideas, and among the most quietly explosive imports, sexuality. Rome was already expert at conquest, but now it starts borrowing, imitating, fetishizing. Tonight you're stepping into a room filled with incense and anticipation, where Eastern fabrics cling to Western bodies, and Rome falls in lust with the exotic. Let's get one thing straight. Romans didn't just conquer for land. They conquered for novelty, for difference, for delight. And nowhere did this hunger show itself more vividly than in how they consumed other cultures' sexual customs. To them, the East, especially Egypt, Syria, and parts of Asia Minor, was a place of mystery and indulgence. A land where passion was less about dominance and more about ecstasy, mysticism, and slow-burning seduction. Start with Egypt. Cleopatra was more than a queen. She was a walking threat to Roman masculinity. Not because she led armies or made deals, but because she wielded sexuality like a scepter. To Roman writers, Cleopatra didn't just enchant Caesar and Mark Antony. She emasculated them. She bathed in perfumed milk, dined on pearls, and reclined like a goddess in silk while men fell at her feet. Roman commentators weren't just annoyed, they were scared. She represented a kind of femininity that didn't fit their script, unapologetic, intellectual, and sensually powerful. To counter her influence, Roman poets like Horace and Lucan painted Cleopatra as excessive, dangerous, and foreign, a corrupter of good Roman blood. But beneath the warnings, there's fascination. You can feel it in the verses, the flickering jealousy wrapped in xenophobia. She was, in their eyes, the ultimate fantasy and the ultimate cautionary tale. And it wasn't just queens who stirred Roman interest. Eastern religions and their sensual rituals also caught the attention and the suspicion of the Roman elite. Cults like those of Isis, Mithras, and Dionysus brought new flavours of worship that included ecstatic dances, wine-fueled processions, and sometimes sexually charged initiation rites. Roman senators grumbled about orgiastic practices and foreign corruption, but guess who kept showing up to those festivals? Everyone. Take the cult of Isis, for example. Imported from Egypt, Isis worship was both religious and deeply emotional, filled with drumming, veils, and symbolic rebirth. Priestesses wore flowing garments and moved with choreographed sensuality. Initiates were expected to abstain from sex, then cleanse themselves in long purification rituals, after which some sources suggest there were, let's say, intimate reenactments of divine union. Officially, of course, it was all symbolic, but in Rome, symbolism and reality were often separated by a very thin sheet. And let's not forget India. Trade with the subcontinent brought exotic spices, jewels, and erotic texts. While the Romans never fully translated something like the Kama Sutra, There are surviving fragments of Roman writings that reference Eastern arts of lovemaking. Poets like Martial drop lines about Indian positions, or Eastern girls who know how to move. It's hard to tell whether they meant literal knowledge or just a fantasy about flexibility. But the myth of the Eastern lover, skilled, supple, uninhibited, was firmly planted in Roman imagination. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In some elite Roman homes, erotic objects from the East were used as bedroom props. Items like elaborately carved ivory dildos, fans made of peacock feathers, and even mirrored furniture imported from Alexandria. These weren't just functional, they were performative. Owning such things wasn't just about pleasure, it was about aesthetic, about saying, look how cosmopolitan my bedroom is. But of course all this fascination came wrapped in judgment. Roman moralists constantly warned about foreign softness. The idea was that Roman men, raised on military discipline and civic duty, were being weakened by silks, spices, and sex positions that required more stretching than stabbing. These warnings almost always smacked of hypocrisy. The same senator who condemned Syrian incense in the Forum might be lying on a perfumed couch that night, being fed dates by a dancing girl from the Levant. This dynamic, desire mixed with judgment, reveals one of Rome's most persistent contradictions. They craved the new but feared being changed by it. They wanted the exotic in their beds but not in their laws. They wanted to look eastward but only from the safety of a Roman frame. And nowhere was this more visible than in the performances of the day. In Roman theatre, Eastern characters were often depicted as sensual, sly, and untrustworthy. The men wore eyeliner and swayed their hips. The women were oversexed and manipulative. It was xenophobic, yes, but also revealing. Because underneath the mockery was an unmistakable yearning. These characters might be ridiculed, but they were never boring. This is what modern scholars call cultural eroticization, the act of projecting desire onto foreign identities while keeping them othered. And it wasn't unique to Rome, but Rome perfected it. Even the language of sex became steeped in geography. Want something slow and luxurious? Eastern? Fast and primal? Germanic? Decadent and weird? Egyptian? The entire map was turned into a menu. Conquest as cuisine, desire as cartography. As you walk through a wealthy Roman home tonight, you notice the blend of influences. Egyptian alabaster perfume bottles on a Syrian table. A mosaic showing Aphrodite with features clearly modelled on Cleopatra. Drapes dyed with Indian indigo. And in the master's chamber, a small bronze statue of a dancing girl, her pose unmistakably Eastern, her origin left unnamed. The candlelight flickers across her metal body, and for a moment, she seems to move. Rome was never just a city of marble, it was a city of mirrors, always watching, always reflecting, always borrowing, especially in the bedroom. The streets are quieter now, shadows stretching longer over broken columns and sun-bleached facades. The empire is no longer young. You can feel it in the brittle air, in the way the statues seem to lean with exhaustion. Tonight, you're wandering through late imperial Rome, where the golden age has tarnished, the gods have dimmed, and sex, once celebrated in open murals and marble reliefs, is becoming a whisper. But even as the empire trembles under the weight of its own ambitions, desire doesn't disappear. It adapts, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the lives of those who lived on Rome's margins. Because while the emperors issued decrees and bishops wrote sermons, ordinary Romans were still doing what they'd always done, finding love, losing it, cheating on it, and occasionally paying for it. Let's drop into the cramped, smoky taverns and cheap apartment blocks where the real Romans lived. The insulae, as they were called, were multi-storey buildings that housed most of the population. Packed, loud and prone to fire, these buildings were home to the bakers, barbers, weavers, prostitutes, ex-soldiers and widows who kept the empire running, and their sex lives were a far cry from the elegance of Ovid or the moralism of St. Augustine. Here, relationships were shaped more by proximity than poetry. You slept with who lived next door, worked the same stall, or shared your rooftop laundry line. There were no orchestras, scented oils, or just the scrape of clay tiles under your back, and maybe a fig for breakfast the next morning if things went well. But these moments mattered, because for most Romans, sex wasn't performance, it was release. A momentary relief from hunger, labour, and the cold fact that the empire didn't care whether you were in love. And yet, even in this corner of the city, there was hierarchy. Roman society was obsessed with rank, and sex didn't escape the rule. A freedman could sleep with a prostitute, but not a senator's daughter. A slave had no say at all. Women, especially poor women, walked a tightrope between affection and accusation. Too many lovers, and you risked being labelled a meretrix, a term that could mean prostitute or just sexually available. Too few, and you were mocked as dried up, undesirable, useless. And speaking of meretrices, prostitution in late Rome had become more institutionalised than ever. There were official brothels, registered sex workers, and even tax categories for prostitutes. The state didn't just tolerate sex work, it profited from it. A woman, or man, could register with the aediles and pay a tax in exchange for legal protection and the right to operate. Sounds progressive, right? Sort of. It also came with a permanent social stain. Once registered, you couldn't legally marry a citizen of high rank. You were branded, figuratively, sometimes literally, as a lower class of human. But that didn't mean prostitutes didn't have power. Some built loyal clienteles, others owned property, a few even ran their own brothels, employing younger workers and managing finances like any shrewd entrepreneur. Sex work was dangerous, yes, but it could also be a way out, especially for freed women with no family support. In the alleys and upper balconies of Rome, sex was currency, and for some, the only one available. And what about queer love? While Christianity was steadily reshaping public attitudes, the reality on the ground hadn't changed overnight. Men still pursued men, women still found each other and shared beds and bathhouses. The law might have started to tighten, but enforcement was inconsistent. In taverns and marketplaces, older traditions of same-sex relationships, especially between older men and younger boys, lingered, though increasingly stigmatized. One particularly strange law from the 4th century attempted to ban same-sex weddings by declaring that men who marry men would be burned alive. Sounds harsh, and it was, but it also confirmed something important. These marriages were happening, quietly without state approval, but often with ceremony and commitment. Some couples exchanged vows, others wore matching rings or carved their names side by side in stone. It wasn't widespread, it wasn't safe, but it was real, and still, sex in late Rome wasn't all shame and suppression. People found ways to be tender. A widow with 2 children might fall for a neighbour who helped her carry water. A weaver and a bricklayer might share a rented room and call it love even if no one else did. A slave and her master might develop something complicated, some mixture of duty, protection and yearning that blurred all boundaries. Was it healthy? Sometimes. Was it exploitation? Often. But it was real and messy and human. Here's your fringe fact of the night. Love spells didn't go out of fashion just because Christianity was on the rise. In fact, magical texts from the late Empire often blend Christian language with old pagan formulas. You'll see invocations to Jesus right alongside requests to bind her thighs and heart. A lead tablet from this period reads, "In the name of the living God, may she know no peace until she lies with me." Desire didn't care about doctrine, it just changed its costume. And amid all this, one of the most fascinating voices we hear is that of Augustine, bishop, philosopher, and deeply conflicted ex-lover. Before his conversion, Augustine lived with a concubine for over a decade and fathered a son. His writings are a swirl of guilt, longing, and regret. He didn't just reject sex, he mourned it. And in doing so, he put into words the tension that was stretching across Rome like a crack in the marble. The body wants, the soul resists, the empire is fading. And no one knows what comes next. So tonight, you walk through the ashes of a dying era. The paintings are peeling, the temples are crumbling, and the streets hum with uncertainty. But behind a curtain, a couple lies tangled in sleep. In a corner room, someone whispers a name in the dark. In the forum, a boy carves a heart into stone. And in that quiet, defiant act, you see it. Rome's pulse, faint, but still beating. The hour grows late, and the streets of Rome are darker now, less from the setting sun and more from the weight of time. The old empire is beginning to crumble, one province at a time, like a great mosaic flaking apart. But even as emperors are assassinated, borders are breached, and Christian monks begin copying scripture in cold stone rooms, one stubborn fact remains. People are still falling in and out of bed with one another. Because no matter what happens in the Senate or the sanctuary, the body remembers what it wants. Tonight, you're stepping into the fading light of the empire, not to mourn it, but to witness how desire adapts to decline. By the late 5th century CE, Rome isn't what it used to be. The city has been sacked once, twice, maybe again depending on which historians you trust. The roads are falling apart, trade has slowed. The great bathhouses are mostly closed or repurposed into storage or rubble. The temples are silent, their statues defaced or stolen. But in the shadows of these grand ruins, the human rituals go on, quietly, carefully, sometimes even joyfully. You meet a man named Severinus. He's a freedman, maybe 60, with a cough and a long memory. He remembers when the Forum was full of colour, when the Vestals still walked in white, when sex was something you could joke about in public. Now he trades scraps of bronze for bread and occasionally sneaks into the half-collapsed baths near the Aventine to meet his lover, a wine merchant's son named Darius. It's not political. It's not even very dramatic. It's just comfort. In a world that's breaking, they still have each other. And when they lie together, they pretend for a moment that Rome still stands. Their story isn't unusual. In the chaos of decline, people cling tighter to what's immediate. Love, touch, bodies. In a time where tomorrow isn't guaranteed, sex becomes less a performance and more an anchor. There are no more extravagant banquets or perfumed orgies, just stolen moments behind crumbling columns. A kiss exchanged beside a dry fountain. A smile in the market before dusk. But for all the intimacy, this is also a time of deepening control. The church, once persecuted and underground, is now the new power. Bishops are replacing magistrates. Cathedrals are swallowing temples brick by brick. And the rules of sex, they're changing again, this time with even tighter chains. Clergy begin preaching that even within marriage, sex is suspect. If it's not for procreation, it's sinful. If it's too pleasurable, it's pride. If it's between two men, or two women, it's an abomination. The golden age of Roman sexual plurality is rapidly shrinking into a single narrow corridor, and anything outside it is labelled deviant. Yet people still break the rules. There's Claudia, a midwife's daughter, who falls for the daughter of a baker. They exchange glances during Sunday Mass, pass notes under bread loaves, and one night meet in a barn outside the city. They don't know Greek poetry or Ovid's rules of seduction. They just know each other. It's not easy. It's not safe, but for a few stolen nights it's theirs. There's Lucius, a soldier-turned-farmer who still wears a small bronze amulet beneath his tunic. It shows Venus, naked, smiling, her arm lifted in invitation. His priest tells him to burn it. Instead, he buries it near his vineyard, whispering a prayer not to God but to the goddess who once taught him how to kiss. And here's your fringe fact for tonight. Archaeological digs in post-Empire ruins have uncovered amulets and tokens engraved with crude erotic scenes. Still carried, still hidden, still will be cherished, and even when officially condemned, desire leaves fingerprints. You can't purge the body of longing with a sermon. You can't erase centuries of custom with a single decree. Of course, not all is gentle rebellion. In the vacuum of imperial collapse, power often shifts violently. In some towns, religious extremists burn what they consider pagan. Erotic murals are chiselled off walls. Statues of Priapus are smashed. Women suspected of unchristian behaviour are publicly humiliated. Midwives are questioned, sometimes imprisoned, for practising sorcery. The freedom to manage one's own body, never great to begin with, is now policed with prayers and threats. The new empire is spiritual, and it wants the control over not just what you do, but what you desire. But again, resistance finds its way. In the private letters of this era, we glimpse coded affection. In obscure corners of early monasteries, scribes copy not only scriptures, but the occasional bawdy poem tucked between psalms. Even as Rome falls, the memory of its sensual legacy refuses to die. It's just hiding. Scholars today debate what to call this period. Is it a decline, a transformation, a tragic loss, or a necessary evolution? Some argue that as Rome crumbled, its people gained a deeper sense of inner life, a move from outward sensuality to inward contemplation. Others insist that it was a crackdown, a retreat into fear. Maybe it's both. Maybe every ending is a little of each. What's clear is this. The history of Roman sexuality didn't end when the emperors fell. It morphed into medieval anxieties, into church doctrines, into Renaissance rediscoveries. The blush of Venus became the whisper of Eve. The phallic graffiti became forbidden knowledge. And yet the body, tired, stubborn, miraculous, kept insisting on being felt. Tonight, as you walk the outskirts of the ruined city, you pass a small, crumbling villa. Inside, a couple shares a blanket, curled together, not for spectacle, but for warmth. They don't know they're living at the edge of an era. They just know the shape of each other's breath in the dark. The empire may be ending, but the story of sex, it never does. The wind tonight smells like dust and damp stone, like a world being slowly buried and preserved all at once. You're standing in the wreckage of what was once the centre of the world. Rome, former capital of empire, now a mosaic of broken walls, flickering oil lamps and fading prayers. The gods are around. The emperors are long dead. But their secrets, their scandals and their seductions haven't gone anywhere. They have just gone underground, literally. Because tonight, in Tunane, you're descending into one of the strangest legacies Rome left behind. The layered, accidental archive of ancient sex hidden beneath the city's surface. Frescoes, sculptures, love notes scratched into walls, and forgotten objects buried under centuries of dirt. Welcome to Rome's erotic afterlife. We tend to think of archaeology as clean and sterile, scientists with brushes delicately revealing mosaics and marble. But when it comes to Roman sexuality, the reality is far grittier, more confusing and occasionally hilariously awkward. Because Rome didn't just preserve its buildings, it preserved its bedrooms, its bathhouses, its brothels. And as later generations stumbled across them, especially during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, they didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or cover their eyes. Let's start in Pompeii, which, as you probably know, was frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. When it was rediscovered centuries later, excavators quickly noticed something unusual. The walls, covered in phalluses, the rooms, filled with suggestive statues, the brothels, still contained stone beds, dirty drawings, and faded graffiti with detailed menu options. Imagine being a 19th century explorer expecting noble columns and finding instead a carved note that reads, "Marcellus was here with Fortunata, twice." The reaction from scholars and clergy at the time was pure panic. Erotic artifacts were quietly locked away in Naples' secret cabinet, Gabinetto Segreto, where they remained hidden for decades, viewable only by men of mature age and upright morals, which was code for elite dudes who promised not to giggle. Even Queen Victoria had copies of the Lupinar frescoes removed from display so her daughters wouldn't accidentally learn about reverse cowgirl from a mural. But as time passed, something changed. Scholars began to realise that this wasn't just filth, it was their news data. Rome didn't leave behind journals about desire, but it did leave behind scratched verses, household shrines, and floor mosaics with startlingly graphic content. And these artefacts started telling a story, one far more honest than most written records. The way a wealthy merchant painted Priapus in his atrium, balancing his monstrous phallus on a scale to symbolise prosperity. The way a common tavern scratched jokes about Ampliatus's lover, who screams louder than a gladiator. The way certain homes had side rooms filled with erotic frescoes, not hidden but displayed about. Entertainment for dinner guests maybe, or reminders of life's pleasures before the bread arrived. And then there are the objects. Oil lamps shaped like couples mid-coitus. Bronze charms depicting multiple sexual positions, some with inscriptions like Futuo and Philar, so subtle they are not. Phallic wind chimes, known as tintinnabula, hung above doorways not just for decoration, but as protective talismans. Romans believed the erect penis warded off the evil eye, which means every time someone stepped into your villa, they were greeted with a little brass dong and a prayer for safety. Classy. But here's where things get strange, in a beautiful, fragile kind of way. Some of the most powerful discoveries aren't about sex acts or anatomy, they're about emotion. Graffiti in places like Herculaneum and Pompeii include messages like Gaius loves Aemilia, or Myrtis, you are the joy of my nights, simple, direct, and deeply human. These weren't declarations made for literature. These were moments of impulse, love carved into plaster before the volcano swallowed it whole. And here's your fringe fact. In 2018, archaeologists uncovered a Roman fresco showing Narcissus gazing at his reflection, painted directly above a bed in a lavish home. The implication? The room's owner wanted to evoke beauty, desire, and maybe a little tragic romance. Bedroom as shrine, sex as art, or at least as aesthetic. But not everything preserved was beautiful. Some graffiti glorified conquest boasted about exploitative relationships or threatened rivals. The darker side of Roman sexuality didn't vanish with time, it calcified. Inscriptions about raping slaves, mocking women's bodies, or bragging about manipulating lovers sit side by side with more tender lines. It's all there, Rome unfiltered. That's what makes studying this material so complicated. Scholars still argue over what to show, how to interpret it, and whether we're projecting modern morals onto ancient dirt. Some want to label everything obscene and hide it again. Others push for open access, believing we can't understand history if we censor its most intimate parts. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Because these artifacts weren't meant for us. They were part of daily life, decorations, jokes, rituals, and sometimes confessions. And in preserving them, we glimpse not just what Rome did, but how Rome felt. Now think about this. For most of Western history, sexuality was wrapped in dance. But here in Rome, there it is, chiseled into stone, painted across walls, lying under ash. Visible, proud, messy, sometimes beautiful, sometimes awful, always honest. Tonight, as you leave the ruins and walk past the modern metal gate surrounding Pompeii's old brothel, you catch a glimpse of one of the frescoes through the bars. It's faded now, cracked by centuries, but the figures still move, one reclining, the other kneeling, both mid-embrace. You think about the person who painted it, about the client who chose it, about the worker who glanced at it between strangers, and about the centuries of people who tried to bury it. Desire doesn't stay buried. It waits. It lingers. It survives empires. And in the end, it's the softest things, whispers, moans, hand-carved hearts, that outlast marble and myth. It's your last night in Rome, the final flicker of lamplight on ancient stone. The air is still, heavy with stories, as if the city itself is holding its breath, reluctant to let you leave. You've walked the marble floors of emperors and the dirty tiles of back-alley brothels. You've sat in steam baths, crept into bedrooms, translated love spells and raunchy graffiti. And now, before you return to your own world, your own bed, you sit at the edge of the Palatine Hill, watching the ruins glow under a moon that's seen every version of love Rome ever dared to invent. What you've seen here is not just history, it's humanity, raw and stubborn and strangely familiar. Sex in ancient Rome wasn't some alien ritual from a lost world. It was just people, lonely, hopeful, reckless, strategic, bored, blissful, using their bodies to speak when words fell short. And because Rome was Rome, everything got scaled up. Every seduction came with poetry, every affair carried political weight, every kink got carved into marble or cast in bronze. But peel back the grandeur, and it's the same old heartbeat. So let's rewind a little, just for a moment, and ask the question we've been circling all along. What was sex really like in ancient Rome? It was complicated. It was celebrated and condemned, public and private, sacred and transactional. It was a source of power, a weapon of humiliation, a gesture of love, a performance, a comfort, a transaction, a game. It was used to build dynasties, to forge alliances, to ruin reputations. It existed within a brutal hierarchy, where freeborn men had the most license, and slaves, women, and the poor were often little more than props in someone else's fantasy. But it was also a place where pleasure was acknowledged as part of being alive. Rome never denied the pull of desire. It made a religion out of it, literally. With temples, holidays, and gods carved from lust. They didn't always get it right, morally, ethically, or emotionally, but they didn't look away from it either. You remember the stories of the Vestal Virgins, powerful women imprisoned by their own chastity, caught between myth and politics. You recall the scandal of Messalina, painted as a nymphomaniac by jealous men, terrified of a woman who liked to be in control. You think of the poor girl in the Suburra who learned to read from graffiti on a brothel wall, of the old man still dreaming of his first lover's perfume, of the midwife who slipped herbs into trembling hands beneath temple shadows, of the lovers who carved their initials into the stone before being turned to ash by a volcano. They're all still here. They're always here. Here's your final fringe fact. The Latin word libido originally meant more than just sexual appetite. It meant desire, pure and undiluted. It could mean ambition, hunger, craving for sex, yes, but also for life, for glory, for anything that made your blood stir. And maybe that's the real lesson Rome has left behind. Desire is not just about bodies, It's about wanting something. Even if that something is a passing touch, a flash of connection, a name whispered against your ear in the dark. Rome reminds us that sex has always been a mirror, reflecting not just what we do, but who we think we are, what we fear, what we hope for, sometimes beautiful, sometimes ugly, always real. You rise from the Palatine stones and begin to walk down the hill. The breeze is warm, like someone exhaling across your shoulders. You pass the ruins of a once mighty villa, the broken statue of a forgotten goddess, and a tile mosaic so worn it barely whispers it's seen anymore. But you don't need it. You've seen enough. Rome is quieter now, but not silent. The whispers are still there if you listen, in the scratch of a stylus, in the rustle of linen robes, in the echo of a half-stifled laugh. The empire has fallen, the bathhouses are cold, the forums are weeds, but sex? Sex walks with the wind, it always did. So before you close your eyes tonight, let yourself linger here a moment longer. Let yourself feel the weight of 2,000 years of desire, messy, complicated, unfiltered, and take it with you. Not to judge, not to imitate, just to remember that even in the ruins of empires the heart keeps reaching, and sometimes the hand follows. And now the journey comes to a hush. You've made it all the way through the tangled alleys of Roman passion, the steaming chaos of the bathhouses, the chilling truths whispered by curse tablets, the tangled power games, and the tender graffiti that still clings to cracked walls. You've walked through sacred temples and behind tavern doors, listened to moans echoing beneath marble ceilings, and heard prayers muttered in desperation from the beds of both pleasure and pain. You've seen Rome exposed, not the one in schoolbooks, not the one wrapped in laurels and military triumph, but the Rome of bodies, wanting, reaching, scheming, surrendering. And now, in the quiet after the storm, you sit in the soft dark of your room, maybe with a fan humming gently beside you, maybe with your own skin a little warmer than when we started. Your mind is buzzing, full of unexpected facts and stranger emotions. You might feel unsettled, a little amused, a little awed. That's okay. That's exactly where you're meant to be. Because the goal was never to sanitize Rome or to gawk at it, but to sit with it, to see it clearly, and to feel it hum beneath your fingertips. Sex in ancient Rome wasn't a footnote. It was a force. It drove marriages, wars, laws, and poetry. It ruined reputations and saved legacies. It wasn't always fair or safe or consensual. But it was honest. It was human. And even now, centuries later, it still reaches out from frescoed walls and scribbled margins saying, "This too was us." So if you've made it this far, you've done more than learn history. You've listened to it. Not just through the facts and the debates, but through the breath of it, through the late-night sighs, the forbidden glances, the inked hearts, the fevered prayers. You've heard the real Rome, the Rome that existed not only in senate halls and battlefields, but in bedrooms and back stairwells. And now you get to carry that with you. Not the titillation, not the trivia, but the recognition that long before we had hashtags and dating apps, long before shame and virtue were coded into algorithms, people were already trying to figure out the same things we are now. How to love, how to touch, how to be known, and how to not be alone. So, dim the lights one last time. Let your breath slow. Let the city fade around you, the pillars, the dust, the painted gods, and let your body sink into stillness. You've been on a wild, whispered, uncomfortable, unforgettable ride, and now you sleep.